and welcome to this online conference on Israeli national security, brought to you by Haaretz and the Y&S Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the Nazarian Center and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA. The mission of the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies is to promote the study of modern Israel at UCLA and beyond. To that end, the Nazarian Center sponsors courses about Israel for UCLA students, generates and disseminates academic research in the field of Israel studies, organizes frequent public programs, and hosts visiting scholars, writers, and artists. Since the outbreak of the pandemic, our public programming has moved online, and we've been able to reach a worldwide audience. By partnering with Haaretz to organize this conference, we hope to reach even more people and help promote a broader and deeper understanding of Israeli national security and the strategic challenges Israel currently faces. We've identified three major strategic challenges, though there are, of course, others. The first and most immediate is the Iranian nuclear program and what's been called Israel's shadow war with Iran, a covert war that's been taking place for some time now and has become more open recently. There's a growing danger of a full-blown war between Israel and Iran, which would probably also involve the United States, as well as the growing risk that Iran will soon be able to cross the nuclear threshold and become a nuclear-armed state, or at least a state with the capability to quickly build a nuclear weapon. While the danger of a nuclear-armed Iran preoccupies Israeli policymakers and security officials, there is another danger that generally receives less attention: the danger that the conflict with the Palestinians will become insoluble as the possibility of a two-state solution to the conflict disappears. Finding a way to peacefully and equitably resolve this conflict, or at least reduce it, is Israel's second strategic challenge, and it is no less pressing than Iran's nuclear program. Israel's ability to deal with both of these strategic challenges and others depends in part on its long-standing de facto alliance with the United States, Israel's closest ally. Maintaining bipartisan American support for this alliance at a time of increasing partisan political polarization in the United States is therefore another pressing strategic challenge for Israel. To discuss these three critical challenges and what Israel should do about them, we have assembled an amazing lineup of speakers, including current and former Israeli policymakers and leading experts from Israel and the United States. We will hear from Benny Gantz and Robert Menendez, from Yossi Cohen, Tzipi Livni, and Merav Michaeli, and we'll have three panel discussions. I hope you will find these speeches, interviews, and panels to be interesting, informative, and thought-provoking. I'm sure I will. I'm delighted that the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies has been able to partner with Haaretz to bring you this conference. I'd like to thank the team at Haaretz, especially Aluf Ben, Amir Tibon, Omer Schubert, and Nufa Chen, and my team at the Nazarian Center, particularly Maura Resnick and Jane Matusovskaya, for all their hard work in organizing this conference. I'd also like to thank our donors for funding this conference and all the speakers for generously giving their time and sharing their expertise and insights. And now I will turn over to Aluf Ben, Haaretz's editor-in-chief.
Thank you, Dov. I'm happy to open the first conference on Israel's national security, and I want to thank our partners from the UCLA Y&S Nazarian Center for Israel Studies for making this happen, along with my colleagues at Haaretz. Our conference takes place when new governments are leading both the United States and Israel. The Biden administration and the Bennett government are struggling with similar challenges: shaky public support and the overbearing shadow of the populist predecessors, Trump and Netanyahu. And both Bennett and Biden are trying to shape new responses to old challenges, or at least to show new diplomatic styles. We're approaching November 29th, that is the anniversary of the UN partition plan in Palestine and the Palestine Day at the United Nations, and now also the planned day for resumption of talks with Iran on the nuclear deal with the superpowers. Are we facing the crossing of nuclear threshold in Iran, Or have we, as former Prime Minister Ehud Barak had stated, already approached it? What does it mean to Israel's national security? Is there still anything to talk about with the Iranians? Are we facing a bombing or bomb dilemma for Israel? And what would be the boundaries of a possible Israeli policy, with or without American support? The current regional and global focus on Iran's nuclear development and power projection as the key Middle Eastern issues, the divider of nations and alliances, overshadows the Palestinian issue. Prime Minister Bennett indicated that he has no interest in pursuing a deal or even talks with the Palestinian Authority leadership. And presiding over this unprecedented right-left coalition that for the first time includes an Arab party, Bennett plays a very delicate balancing act. While passing the budget is giving him some breathing space and time to maneuver. Bennett has tried to please both political ends. The left by allowing small, mostly economic gestures to the Palestinian Authority and allowing some ministers to meet President Abbas. And the right, his former support base, by approving new settlement construction, declaring civil society organizations in the PA as terrorist groups, and objecting the reopening of the US consulate in Jerusalem, closed by Trump, which served as a thinly veiled embassy to the Palestinians in the past. Can Bennett proceed and go on with this tightrope dance, giving little while expecting the relative quiet security situation vis-à-vis the Palestinians to prevail? Or would the inevitable dilemmas, conflicts, and hard decisions on Gaza, on the future of the Palestinian Authority after Abbas, on Israel's settlement expansion, are merely delayed and will return in the third act, if not the second act? The consulate disagreement notwithstanding, the Biden administration has shown strong support for Israel's new government. Biden avoided Netanyahu after he took office, but he was happy to host Bennett at the White House and enjoy a joint photo with Bennett in Glasgow at the climate conference, where they both attended. Obvious ideological gaps exist between the former CEO of the Yesha Council, the settler lobby group, and the current leader of the American left wing. But are they merely swept under the rug in order to keep Netanyahu away from office? Or will they implode in some way and harm the relationship, as we see in the disagreement over the consulate, over the proposed agreement with Iran, and other issues? Could Biden, with his perceived weakness, both domestically and internationally, and his foreign policy focus on the de facto Cold War with China, would he have the energy or political interest to push America again into the Israeli-Palestinian arena? Or would Biden suffice with Bennett avoiding any game changers and simply keeping the issue away from the American radar for as long as deep as possible? Netanyahu sided firmly with the Republicans, and particularly President Trump, imitating his style. But his opponents failed, and successors, Netanyahu sided firmly with the Republicans, and particularly with President Trump, imitating his style. But Netanyahu's opponents and successors so far have failed to build similar rapport with the Democratic Party, where a vocal left wing strongly opposes the current US support, and particularly its military aid to Israel. Is Israel at risk of losing an even bigger chunk of its American support base, or can it bring back some bipartisanship into the relations? Iran and the Palestinians, the future of the American alliance with Israel are the key issues driving Israel's foreign policy and national security agenda, and obviously will be the focus of our conference today. And I wish all of us a fruitful, challenging, and hopefully surprising day. Thank you.
I'm delighted to address you in this forum. As a young soldier, my first ever operational mission was guarding Egyptian President Sadat's convoy during his first historic visit to Israel. Today, I'm serving as Israel's Minister of Defense during a time when we have peace with Egypt and Jordan and a groundbreaking normalization agreements with the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. This is time when I'm more hopeful than ever that we can multiply the success of these accords. These agreements are critical so that the region may flourish and so that we may stand strong against common threats. These threats are all originated and coordinated by Iran, which is a global and regional challenge, as well as a challenge to the State of Israel. Iran sees itself as a hegemon, systematically equipping terror armies and exporting its radical ideology, weapons, funds, and manpower across the Middle East. They target economic resources, as we saw in the Aramco attack case, disrupt global trade, as we saw in the Mercer Street attack case, harm democratic processes, as we see in the Iraqi elections, and dismantle regime, as we see in Lebanon and in Syria. Everything that Iran is doing now is taking place without nuclear canopy. Imagine what will happen if Iran reaches a nuclear threshold. I can support an agreement that will be broader, stronger, and longer, taking Iran back, dismantling its current capabilities, and placing effective inspections on its sites and on its weapons production. Iran poses a serious threat to global peace and potential existential threat to Israel. We will continue to act, ensuring that Iran will never achieve military nuclear capabilities. This conference is not only dealing with the challenges, but also remarks the opportunities that we have in the region. One of them is strengthening the ties between Israel and its neighbors. When I met Palestinian Authority Chairman Abu Mazen, I told him that regardless of our differences, nobody on either side is going anywhere, and we will have to live side by side. As I see it, we have an opportunity to build trust between Israel and the Palestinians, taking measures on the ground that will contribute to security, stability, and economic prosperity, steps that will benefit both sides. At a time of both great optimism and increasing threats in the region, the international community, led by the United States, EU, and partners in the Middle East, should invest in their goodwill and resources in improving Palestinian life and economy. This will contribute to peace and stability and enable us to continue building the foundation for our common future. Having discussed our challenges and opportunities, we must remember that Israel's ability to both defend itself and to seek peace lies in the resilience of our society. The Israeli government is committed to this issue. Israel's social resilience, partnership with the international friends and the strong bonds with the Jewish communities around the world will guarantee our future in this complex region. Thank you all.
I want to welcome Yossi Cohen, former director of the Mossad and former head of the National Security Council in Israel, and currently the head of SoftBank in Israel. Welcome, Yossi.
Good morning, sir. Thank you.
We're approaching November 29th, presumed date of resumed talks between the superpowers and Iran on maybe a new nuclear agreement. Is there still anything to talk about with the Iranians, or are they already breaking out away from any supervision, safeguards, straight to the bomb?
Well, the current situation actually is absolutely complicated, since there is an agreement that the Iranians do not respect, and there are some achievements that have to be achieved in the negotiations if to be resumed by the powers and Iran.
Like what?
The Iranians today are enriching because they can enrich. Both bunkers that are holding advanced centrifuges of a more advanced type that had been in the past are rotating and enriching uranium to the level that the Iranians decide. This is something, in my opinion, that has to be absolutely seized and stopped. And I think when we discuss the cycle of the nuclear fissile materials, this is something that has to be eventually rearranged or, in my...
Broken apart, in a way.
Broken apart from the entire agreement, because I believe that broken apart completely, I mean, to destroy the facilities is something that has to be done by this agreement completely. Because of what? Iran today enriches because it can and because of its own decision. If the agreement would have taken all its capabilities and not their willingness, they are willing to have a nuclear bomb. Let's say they hadn't. That's a different story. But let's assume they are willing to have a nuclear bomb. Since they have the capabilities to enrich, and since they're holding the entire fissile materials cycle, as we call it, they can decide themselves when and for how, how long or how much.
But isn't it too late, as former Prime Minister Barak suggested, that it's already too late and that we have to learn to live with the possibility of an Iranian nuclear bomb in the near future?
No, I think it's never late. Actually, first, we have to all the time put statement in front of our eyes. One is that Israel will never let the Iranians to hold a military nuclear capability. This is something that we have to adapt ourselves in our new lives all the time.
Can Israel go it alone without superpower cover, without American support?
I think that Israel should have the ability to fight this aspect alone, like we did twice in the past. I mean, when Iraqis have decided to go onto the nuclear military path, we have attacked it. When the Syrians did the same with the help of North Korea, we did the same.
But in a much less sophisticated program with one major facility rather than bunkers and thousands of...
I assume that it's going to be complicated militarily, operationally, but I don't think that it is impossible. I think that if the State of Israel will decide to get, if I may, rid of this program that the Iranians do not really need for them protection, we can do it and we will have to do it.
And but you know, several of your predecessors and the head of Mossad, like Ephraim Halevi and Tamir Pardo, and I would assume that the late Meir Dagan would have agreed, criticized Netanyahu's decision to convince convince Trump to let go, to leave the nuclear agreement 3 years ago, and they argued that, and they're not alone, argued that this was a major blunder for Israeli strategy.
I don't think that all the names mentioned would have agreed with one political or diplomatic structure towards Iran. I mean, Israeli system is different. I mean, we're very colored, if I may, I mean, in our versions of holding this diplomatic asset. My opinion is, and it was my opinion when I was Deputy Director of the Mossad, when I was, as mentioned, National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, and of course Director of the Mossad, that we as Israelis should do our utmost to get rid of their capabilities within negotiations. This would be the best, of course, if Iran would come clean.
Yeah, but Israel persuaded the United States to leave the agreement, to let the Iranians go on their own.
We had shown the Americans, and I believe the world within the American society, that Iran lied all the way to the deal. It lied because it was not coming clean with many issues and subjects that were hidden from the world and from us too. That was, by the way, the main target of the so-called the nuclear archive operation. We had to bring materials from within the military group, from within the group of Muslim
but you brought materials
to prove that Iran is holding better and better capabilities than we knew.
But even if you won the PR case, still they're enriching uranium more than they did when the agreement was still there. So you have a major operational success.
This is true, but I was honored really honored to be one of the prime negotiators by the State of Israel with the P5+1 when President Obama was the president and my counterparts were negotiating. Susan Rice as National Security Advisor, Wendy Sherman, Undersecretary of John Kerry, etc. And we were explaining then, not only to the American allies and colleagues of ours, but to the world entirely, to the P5+1 and the IAEA in Vienna as well, that a good agreement is possible. That a good agreement means close up to a complete shutdown. These two bunkers that you've mentioned, Aluf, this is absolutely right. There is a major question here. Why does Iran enrich? Why do they need enrichment capabilities and capacities? They do not.
So you had a PR success, and and many other operations attributed in the foreign media to Israel or to Mossad or to other names and euphemisms of Israel,
right,
to destroy this facility, that centrifuge, to kill that scientist or engineer or whatever. But still, they're enriching more uranium. So you may have operational success and strategic collapse.
This is such a good question because
strategic failure.
If you ask yourself, why is it that Iran can enrich? Because of a decision. They can enrich uranium as they want due to their own decision.
Yeah, but they're not deterred by. But they're not deterred. If you kill one scientist, the others are still coming to work.
If they haven't had their capability to enrich, this would not be the case. My request was, and still today, resuming the talks within, let's say, a few days, is that these two bunkers and the enrichment capability will be dismissed completely. Then there is not a discussion between us and the Americans and the Chinese and the Russians and the 3Es and the IAEA in Vienna about what's going to be the future of Iran on that sense, because the major problem of this agreement is that it has limit in time.
And that it lives infrastructure in there.
It lives infrastructures, not only that. Scientists and their science capabilities is growing. Facilities have been improved, both. Natanz and Fordo is not Natanz and Fordo of 2015. And that was allowed.
Well, this is my argument, that with covert action, you cannot just, you can damage it, but you cannot destroy it altogether.
You can damage.
You can kill one scientist, 10 scientists, not 1,000.
I agree with you, totally. You can damage, you can slow down their capabilities. Every single thing that we had been, according to foreign reports, doing in Iran is to make sure that they keep enough distance of capabilities, not of willingness, from the bomb. That was it. And then, if we did what we did, and let's say that was in our asset strategic item to do or to keep this distance as it is, I think that we've done it correctly. Up to date, Iran is not closer to the bomb than it was in the past. It is not closer than it was before the agreement. It is not closer because they violate the agreement. This is not the case. It is true that there is all the time a kind of a need on the Iranian strategy understanding to go into more sophisticated facilities, capabilities, and advanced centrifuges so they can enrich uranium better. I think that the world should ask itself one major question. Why is Iran enriching? They do not need any enriched uranium, rather to use it in a nuclear weapon. And this is something that the State of Israel, National Security Advisor then, not too late to go
directed the
Mossad, I opposed that dramatically.
And you think that the current government in Israel is following the same strategy?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, as far as I know, I believe that the State of Israel of to date, the Prime Minister, National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of today.
He was one of your subordinates.
He was one of my subordinates, Dr. Eyal Khulata. They're absolutely updated of the Iranian deeds. And I think that they would run the same strategy as before, saying one thing: Iran could never acquire
But
nuclear weapon, and instead of Israel will do everything
But there
in
was
its capabilities to make sure that it will not happen.
There was an argument that there was a lot of action, but not a real strategy of how to deal with if, in case the agreement fails and so on.
In case of the agreement
That during the Netanyahu government, you were, there was some inner circle of people.
Just a little reminder, I think it is important, Aluf, it was a very long process. I mean, Obama's administration's engagement with Iran was longer than the last term. It was longer than 4 years. Then we got part of the negotiations. We're trying to make our best influence as in between friends, as in between always America and Israel. Not conflicting each other, but maybe seeing things differently from different views.
And crystal ball, are they going to to reach an agreement, a new agreement with Iran?
I'm not sure if today's possibilities to reach an agreement, because in Iran there were some changes too. Ibrahim Raisi is not the nice face of Iran as Rouhani was. He is much more extreme in his regional views than his predecessor, and I'm not sure that Iran will agree to run the same.
So crystal ball, you see motion without movement.
I see motion with a lot of emotion, but
then again, it falls back to the Israeli decision makers to find a way to deal with it without counting on the superpowers to do the job.
The best thing would be that if Israel and America, which is eventually the absolute best friend of the State of Israel ever, will decide together, as President Biden has recently declared. And I was honored to see Mr. Biden myself on my last month of my term as the director of the Mossad. And it was agreed, not only with me, but with the Prime Minister of Israel afterwards as well, that Iran, to both of us, will never be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons. This is too dangerous for the region, too dangerous for the State of Israel entirely.
Do you have aspirations, as rumored, to be the next Prime Minister?
I'm not in politics today. I'm absolutely in business. I invest most of my time to translate Zionism into these economical assets that are super important for the prosperity of the State of Israel. And this is what I do.
You think about politics?
Not now.
Not now. And there was an issue of present you got from a billionaire.
This interview. I think that we discussed national security, not my private life, but.
But did you find a way to give it back, as you said?
Yes.
Yes, it's over.
I hope it's over. I hope.
And last but not least, the issue of NSO, a company that sells cyber offensive products, and now declared by the United States to be harmful to American interests. And at the time, it was a lot of talk about how it helped Israel reach out to, to more peaceful relations around the world. Do you see the conflict here? Do you think the Americans are wrong in this?
I think that this story is absolutely sensitive. I know that officially this story has been dealt in the right offices, and I don't have the obligation nor the freedom to discuss this issue, with your permission.
I see. Well, thank you, Yossi Cohen, for joining us, and for a very interesting, though less than optimistic discussion about Iran and its program.
Thank you very much for having me this morning. Thank you very much, Aluf.
Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for a panel on Iran, Israel, the nuclear file, the negotiations, the biggest story right now in the news in the US-Israel relationship. And when we talk about Israel's strategic challenges, we cannot ignore this one. And we have a great panel for our discussion today. With me in studio, Sima Shine, the head of the Iran program at the INSS here in Israel. Thank you for being with us, Sima. And Amos Harel, a national security correspondent and analyst for Haaretz. Thank you for joining us, Amos. And via Zoom, Dalia Dasakei of the UCLA Berkeley Center and Professor Avner Cohen of the Middlebury Institute. Thank you all for being with us. We have a lot to discuss. Sima, I want to start with you. A new government here in Israel, looking at the United States about to enter renewed talks with Iran. What objectives can this government try to achieve? What should be the requests that come up in talks with the American side before these negotiations are renewed?
So as you know, Israel is quite worried from just going back. The question is, do you go back to what you go back? And this is, I think, the problem. It looks, from Israel's point of view, that the American administration is eager to put back the Iranian issue in the box, and going back to the agreement is the way to do it. So from Israel's point of view, I think it will be important to see that the US doesn't go for something that is called less for less, or more for less, meaning more relief of sanctions for less things that Iran will take upon itself on the nuclear sphere. This is one thing. The other one, which is not less important, is the question of what next. Is it an agreement that within several years will be finished? The sunset will be within several years, or is it going to be a platform for a longer and stronger, as the Biden administration has said at the beginning, that they would prefer to go back and then start negotiations for longer and stronger, which Israel would prefer, of course. At the end of the day, the current main problem today, is that there is an evaluation in Israel that Iran is just wasting time, trying to win more and more time in order to improve its position with the program, to have more enriched uranium for 60%, for 20%, and to be in a better leverage vis-a-vis the US, and of course, shortening the timetable for breakout. So I think it's a complex of issues that are very worrying Israel, but the good news, I would say, is that this government has decided to have the dialogue with the US.
To engage.
Exactly, in closed rooms and not in the press or in speeches.
No, we're not going to see Naftali Bennett flying to Congress.
Exactly.
And Amos, I'm going to ask you in a minute about the recent history of this issue, and to Avner some questions about more faraway history. But Dalia, I want to ask you, we spoke just with Sima about the new government in Israel. There's also a new government in Iran. What are the objectives for that government when it comes into the nuclear negotiating room now?
Yeah, well, this is, thank you for having me, a great session here. The new government is certainly more hardline. The nuclear deal is a lower priority. They're much more focused on domestic. They are, I think, eager to show that they could get more than the previous government under President Rouhani. Of course, we have to caveat all this by saying the supreme leader, makes the final shots in Tehran. So new governments don't change things as much as, of course, in the case with Israel. But it's clear that they would welcome sanctions relief. They are taking their time, though. They took many months to get back to negotiations that are going to resume later this month. The government was elected last June. So they're not rushing into it. They're kind of mimicking the Biden administration that said they weren't going to rush into it. So they're playing that game. And it's clear that they're going to want some new things from this deal, which could make it very difficult. They're particularly interested in sanctions relief, verification of sanctions relief. They want some guarantees that the Biden administration or any future administration in the US is not going to leave the deal again, which of course is going to be hard to guarantee in a democracy. But I do think that sanctions relief is still going to be the core issue. And in fact, I understand it, the way the deal's been spoken in Iran right now, it's not called the Iran nuclear deal anymore. It's called the sanctions relief deal. So I think they're still, yes, they have workarounds, but I think they're still interested in getting, even if it's short-term boost to their economy, they very much need that.
Amos, in 2019, you wrote a column for us at Haaretz proclaiming that the Trump policy of maximum pressure on Iran, which was strongly encouraged at the time by former Prime Minister Netanyahu, has failed. And when we're looking today at the situation that Israel is facing with Biden and other allies going back to negotiations and Iran looking for the sanctions relief deal, as Dalia just described it, what is the legacy of Netanyahu and Trump on this issue when we examine it in 2021?
Well, I'm glad somebody remembers, or at least I'm glad that I sent you the link to that.
I bookmarked, yes.
Other than that, I think history would judge Netanyahu quite harshly on the Iran portfolio.
Which was the main issue that he, presented to the world for many years.
And there's a huge gap between the rhetoric about Nazi Germany coming back and Iran being the current version of Nazi Germany and saving the Jews from the Holocaust and what actually materialized. Netanyahu, as we know, applied pressure on Trump to withdraw from the nuclear agreement. This happened in 2018. A year or two later, the Iranians began being in breach of the agreement. And finally, as Sima has mentioned, they moved forward with enriching uranium. The end result of that is that we're in a much more dangerous situation now than we were a year or two ago. Netanyahu, what he hoped to achieve, I assume, was either that the maximum pressure and maximum sanctions would, in the end, lead to the collapse of the regime, or that they would be under so much pressure that they would make a mistake, provoke President Trump, and lead to an American attack.
And then America gets the job done for Israel.
None of these scenarios actually materialized, and Iran is where it is right now. Bennett has to deal with all that, and on top of everything else, what he's been hinting for quite some time is that Netanyahu not only misread the map, but also he neglected to prepare the IDF for such a scenario, meaning that for quite some time the IDF was not, especially the Israeli Air Force, was not preparing for the military option, for striking unilaterally at Iranian nuclear sites. Now there's an ongoing discussion whether that was realistic to begin with. We all remember the Barak Netanyahu government in 2011, 2012. We remember the generals resisting the whole idea. But, I mean, most people in Israel would agree that there needs to be at least an alternative, that somebody needs to work on those plans in case the worst-case scenario happens. It turns out that the IDF is quite some time behind this option, and now we're finding ourselves in a situation where we don't have many alternatives. In the end, Israel could, complain a lot and whine a lot and try to affect the American positions, but I don't think that we have much leverage over the negotiations.
Avner, after covering that recent history with Amos, I want to ask you, if we go a little more back in time and we look at a broader view of this, what would it mean for Israel if Iran crossed the threshold apart from the threats? Because it would also mean losing a monopoly on this issue in the region.
Well, the Israeli monopoly is terribly important, is invisible, but at the same time, it's terribly important in terms of the posture, the position, the place of Israel in the Middle East. Losing it in the eyes of essentially all Israeli government, from Barak, including Bennett and Netanyahu, would undermine Israeli position in the region a great deal. For a long, long time, I thought that the issue was not about Iran gaining the bomb or not, but it was a struggle about the distance that Iran would be allowed and ultimately would be pushing itself to be from the bomb. And I think what happened from 2019, actually there was a year of a little lull, a little hesitation on the side of Iran after Trump left the agreement. But from 2019, Iran was moving fast in a variety of areas, in particular in the area of fission materials, to diminish the achievement and to undermine the achievement of the imperfect GSPO, the agreement, the Iran deal of 2015. The result is that I don't think that Iran is on its way to have a breakout towards the bomb. I think they're sneaking towards the bomb. They're trying by the Salami method to cut slice by slice and to be getting closer and closer to the threshold. The fact that they have significant amount of uranium, 60%, some 25%, and much more 20%. And essentially the world is quiet about it. It was done openly, and they're moving, and there is quiet. They're essentially, and there is no any methods to look and to monitor and to verify Iran and its progress in the areas of weaponization, militarizations, and all that. That's create a very dangerous situation. I don't think that Iran will have the bomb anytime very soon, but it creates a very dangerous situation.
Sima, I want to go back to you and ask that, in light of everything we just heard from Dalia and Amos and Avner, what is the better scenario for Israel? A new deal that it doesn't like, or a failure to reach a deal, and then we're not even sure what the consequences are?
So first of all, I have to say that, as you know, it doesn't depend on Israel.
True.
And in this case, and I completely agree with Dalia, it doesn't depend on the US as well. It looks, and as I'm following the Iranian issue for a long time, it looks for me that Iran actually doesn't want to go back. What Iran, of course, if Iran could get the relief of all sanctions. We just got yesterday an article in the newspaper of the government, and has put the demands before the Americans. And one of them is removal of all sanctions from Obama to Trump and today.
Nuclear related or
no,
all sanctions? Okay,
of
good
course.
luck.
And they say this issue of terror and human rights and others, that's not the issue. All sanctions that have been put on Iran should be removed. Nevertheless, of course, Iran should be compensated for what it has suffered in the last 2 years, almost 3 years. So I think if I'm looking on the terms that Iran is putting on the table, one could say it's only bargaining position, but I intend to believe what Iranians are saying, that they mean it. And if they mean it and they want to bring to the table those demands, also the demand of the US not to leave the agreement any time in the future, all these demands are impossible for the American administration. So I do think that we are much more close to a scenario where nothing will happen in Vienna around the table. Of course, it will not happen in this meeting. Iran will do everything is needed in order to have a second meeting or a third meeting, playing on the desire of the Biden administration to have an agreement. But at the end, it will be, and I think even the Americans are starting to say, Secretary Blinken has said, there will be a point in time in the future, and it's not far in the future, that the agreement there will be no need to go, no desire to go back to any agreement, and it will not be possible. So from that point of view, I think that the question, what is better for Israel, it's a good question, but I don't think it is on the table. Israel, I think, would prefer to have, even if the US goes back to the agreement, to have a beginning of a commitment on the side of the Iranians to have a next phase of dialogue, which I don't think will happen. So we are really catched in a situation where nothing is good. Not Iran, neither Iran continuing with its program, as Avner has just mentioned, which is very
sneaking
dangerous.
To the bomb, as
sneaking to the bomb, exactly. Neither the other position that Iran will get relief of everything and will and the agreement will be the sunset will be in several years. So we are really in a catch-22.
Amos, in the past, we saw, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of arguments within the Israeli leadership, mostly between political leadership and the security, intelligence chiefs around the Iran policy. Are we seeing something similar happening today or not yet? A divergence between the elected officials and the intelligence and security chiefs?
Not just yet. I think that when you look at Bennett's positions, at least the outspoken views that he expresses in different interviews and speeches and so on, it's not very different from what Netanyahu has said, minus the Holocaust talk.
Without the exaggeration.
Exactly. But I think that the change mainly is about the fact, and this has to do with everything Bennett does, is that he's very different. His conduct is very different. He comes from a party that has 6 seats. He's not, he's not an autocrat in any way, and he needs to govern through uniting the different parties and so on. So he cannot afford to fight with the generals or the Mossad or Shin Bet chiefs or anything like that. So it's all about more of a freedom of expression, if you'd like, and having the professional level talk directly to power and tell Bennett and others what this is about and what they actually say. The best example for that was in the last days of Netanyahu, when he sent former chief of Mossad Cohen and the chief of staff Kochavi and others to Washington, but he told them that they were forbidden to discuss possible negotiations between Iran and the US because this is something that Israel is not willing to live with.
Going to Washington, but not talking about the most important issue with the new Biden administration.
And this is why Kochavi avoided the mission altogether. I think, I'm joking, but some people have said that the escalation in Gaza was meant to prevent Kochavi from actually needing to go under these orders to Washington. But other than that, I think there's more room for discussion right now. There might be, I think, a debate beginning between Gantz and Bennett. Bennett might be more of a hardliner. We could see that with Rob Malley, the special envoy on Iranian affairs.
He came to Israel and Bennett said, I'm not going to meet him.
Yeah. So the Bennett, people around Bennett
according
explain.
to protocol, it doesn't have to.
Yes,
True.
but I think it was in a way, it was a subtle message that Bennett is trying to keep a distance between him and this issue and not to look as if he's supporting the renewed negotiations between Iran and the United States and the European states. Other than that, I think that at one point or another, Bennett may be tempted to be proactive about Iran. He may be looking for his legacy. You have to remember that in 2 years' time, it will be Lapid as the next prime minister if the coalition holds.
The clock is ticking.
Yeah, and Bennett has to. It's not enough to improve the everyday lives of the Israelis. When he thinks of himself in terms of historic proportions and so on, he's looking for a legacy. And the danger there is that he might be tempted to do something that Netanyahu didn't do. We're still quite far away from that, but I think that we need to consider that as a possibility.
Yeah, politicians looking for a legacy always comes with some
price to pay.
Some warning signs. Dalia, I want to turn to you. We've talked a lot now with Amos and Sim on the Israeli side. A question on the Biden administration. When we hear Secretary of State Blinken saying that other options are on the table, when we hear Biden saying Iran is not going to have a nuclear weapon, period, are they bluffing, or is there really a military alternative from the United States side?
Look, I think it's important to note that the priority is still getting back and getting Iran back into compliance with this deal. That's priority one. And I think it's important to note that President Biden inherited a very bad hand as I hope my internet isn't going here, as I think Amos laid out. So instead of, when Trump withdrew from the deal in 2018, instead of a better deal and a stronger deal and getting Iran more contained, you have no better deal and a less contained Iran. And I agree with Avner's concerns about Iran's current nuclear advances, but it's not exactly sneaking out. These are in full sight. The nuclear deal did contain its program. We had incredibly intrusive inspections. We had most of its uranium enrichment shipped out of the country. And we had a lid on the program. Not perfect, but we had a lid on it. We do not have any constraints or very few constraints at the moment. So I think the Biden administration's priority is going to be to get back to some semblance of nuclear constraint diplomatically. Now, as I said earlier, I think there's a lot of barriers to getting there now, more than there was back in 2015. There's a lot more mistrust on the Iranian side. They feel they fulfilled their side of the deal. They actually were complying with it. We, the United States, left. They're asking for more things now. As Seema said, many of these things are not realistic. It could be just starting positions. But, I think there are reasons to believe there's still a chance. I've been quite pessimistic, actually, since the U.S. withdrawal that we can salvage this thing. And certainly the more Iran advances in the program, the more difficult that will be. But the fact that they're still willing to go to the negotiating table, the fact that you may get less regional resistance, Israel will certainly be concerned, as I think is expressed here. But the rest of the region is starting to de-escalate with Iran on all kinds of regional issues, Yemen and others. So you may actually find less regional resistance, more support for containing this, because the region saw what happened when maximum pressure was enforced on Iran. Iran lashed out and it became a very dangerous neighborhood, oil tankers getting hit, et cetera. So I think a lot of players in the region and the United States does not want to see a repeat of that. But it's going to be hard, no question about it.
That's an understatement. Avner, I want to turn to you and ask you, let's say that we do see the Iranians pushing through and sneaking, as you described it. Do you think at some point this could lead to a change in Israel's strategy of ambiguity on the nuclear file, which you have written a lot about over the years?
It's difficult to see it in the foreseeable future. Foreseeable future meaning short of Iran test a nuclear device, which I think is very unlikely. I think Iran has somebody to imitate and to follow, and they have learned it pretty well. I think they would like to be in a position to have all the components, all the requirements very, very close, not just fission material, but also weaponization, militarization of the program, to be in the distance that would not be known by others exactly, but assumed to be maybe weeks away from the bomb. I'm not saying days, but weeks away from the bomb, and to be comfortable around that. And I believe that before Iran goes to a test, and I believe that this is the major difference between them and North Korea. North Korea wanted very much to make a test, to make a visible change in a statement, and to create a situation that it's clear and understood by everybody. I don't think that's the case with Iran. In Iran, there is a great deal of ambiguity, in part because there is the fatwa, which for some people against nuclear weapon, it's real. For some people, it's pretense. But there is no consensus about it. So even internally, I think it's better for them to shorten the distance from the bomb, to sneak as close as they can, and to push it in a situation that it will be difficult to negotiate over that distance. They are getting closer and closer without doing the test. And I believe that the Israeli interest ultimately would be to keep Israeli restraints as long as Iran does not make that kind of overt move. So in response to your question, I do not see in the immediate foreseeable future any change in the Israeli position unless something very dramatic happens.
So we're speaking a lot about the nuclear issue, but when we talk about Iran as a strategic threat challenge to Israel, it's not just that. And I want to talk to both of you, Sima and Amos, about this. Amos, first of all, we saw some events in recent days that show again the potential damage that Iran can cause in the regional aspect. We saw attacks in Iraq and in Syria, and there has been some disappointment in Israel around the American response to these events. Can you elaborate a bit?
Yes, there's quite a lot of frustration. Most of this is going on behind the scenes. You will not in this government term will you hear Israeli senior officials attacking the United States publicly over its conduct in the region. But when you talk to the senior officials, whether they're from the government or from the IDF, you can hear quite a lot of disappointment about what's going on recently. There were two attacks, one in Tanef, the American base, which is closer to the Jordanian and Iraqi borders in eastern Syria. We were told that a friendly state, so to speak, gave them a prior warning about a possible attack, and that the Americans decided to evacuate their troops. And when Iranian drones hit, nobody was hurt, but nothing happened. There was no retaliation from the American side. Then a week or two later, there was the attack, probably an assassination attempt, or at least a message being sent by Shiite Iraqi militias, the attack on the prime minister's home. And then again, America did nothing except for expressing the fact that it was worried about the situation. So what the Israelis basically are saying is this is going too far. It's one thing that you're willing to discuss resuming negotiations with the Iranians about the nuclear deal. It's another thing that you actually refuse to show any kind of force or flex your muscles or do anything. The Americans have tried to tell Israel that this is no big deal, and they tried to calm the Israelis down by for one thing they did was send a Marine unit to practice with the IDF at the Negev. Another naval exercise that was announced last week.
Together with some Arab states.
Yeah, and the Israelis were surprised that the Americans, that the Fifth Fleet actually decided to make this public. But there was an announcement regarding the Red Sea. And again, this is, some analysts are saying, well, this is a sign that the Americans are supporting Israel and not tough against Iran.
They're committed, they're serious.
Yeah, but I don't think that the Israeli generals are buying this. And I think that, like their counterparts in Saudi Arabia and in Iraq and in the Gulf states, are all beginning to realize that there's a change in the American attitude towards the region. Part of this is the famous pivot that President Obama talked about a decade ago, about moving American interests to the Far East, to East Asia, dealing with China and so on. Part of this is the general agenda now on the table, and the Israelis call it the three C's. It's climate, China, and COVID. Everything else is less interesting for the Americans, and you hear people in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem being more and more worried about this outcome.
Mm-hmm. And Sima, talking on the regional picture, we're also seeing some interesting and contrasting signs about talks between Iran and Arab countries, including some of the Gulf countries that have gotten so close to Israel. How much of a concern is that in Jerusalem these days?
I think, first of all, I think it's an interesting phenomenon. It's not a new one. Actually, Rouhani started with the dialogue with the Saudis, and this government in Iran continues. It falls within a strategy that the Raisi government is trying to portray, that they will put a major emphasis on relations with neighboring countries. Of course, it's important also economically. They have borders with Turkey, with Iraq, and they want to have economic relations with those countries through the border, also to circumvent sanctions if it's possible. So I think what we see now in the region is an interesting developments. Not everything falls within the same camp. On one hand, we see Iran continuing the dialogue with the Emirates. There was with the Saudis, trying to come to terms on some issues, but it's difficult. I mean, the problems are there, the Yemen issue is there, I think it's very difficult. On the other hand, we see Iran having a lot of problems. In Iraq, the last elections, the result of the last elections are very much against the interest of Iran. The militias are less powerful from the point of view of members of parliament than they were in the previous one, and this is something that bothers the Iranians. In Lebanon, we see also a problem. Hezbollah is still the one who is deciding every issue in Lebanon, but at the same time, people are going to the street, are yelling against Hezbollah, against Iran. So I think, and in Syria as well. I mean, Syria was a project that Iran was planning X. It is less than X they wanted. I mean, not only in the nuclear, and not only in the military one, also in the economic one, which the Russians are taking the upper end. So I think the picture is a mixed one. There are things that are showing an improvement in the way the region sees Iran. At the same time, they have a lot of problems. And I think for Iraq is something to watch. It's not only the fact that in the election they lost, it is also the fact that the current prime minister, we don't know who will be the next prime minister, but the current one was trying to open more and more to the Arab Sunni countries and to a little bit balance the Iranian influence, and I think this is something that worries Iran. So the picture from Jerusalem is also a mixed one, and I think the issue of relations of the Abraham Accords that we are a year later, I think they were not, it's interesting that in spite of the Accords, Iran decided to go and negotiate with those countries, accepting in a way the fact that they are in agreement with Israel, normalization, and other hidden relations with Saudis. So the picture is a mixed one. There is a concern of what will happen, but I don't think that in any time Israel was thinking people that are dealing with this issue were thinking that relations with the Emirates and with Bahrain will enable Israel to attack Iran from those countries. Nobody was thinking in those terms. It was important to legitimize their relations with Israel and to make them public, but everybody is saying Iran was the cause. Iran is a common interest, but it wasn't the cause.
Thank you. And Dalia, turning to you and continuing a bit of the discussion we started here with Sima about Iran's relations with other countries, how significant is the recent agreement that we all read about between Iran and China?
Oh, yes. Well, I think just like all regional players are hedging, that's what players do. I completely agree with Sina's analysis. Iran also is hedging, and this isn't new with the current government. This has been a long-standing evolution of stronger Iranian-Chinese ties. But I think, we shouldn't exaggerate the strength of this so-called strategic alignment, a new strategic agreement. Certainly, Iran is looking east, the new government in particular. It's part of their resilience economy strategy, finding workarounds from the Western economic pressure, particularly from the US. But China's partners in the region, its priority partners, are still Sunni Arab countries. They import most of their oil from Iraq and Saudi Arabia, not Iran. So it's still an important party for China, but China's also balancing a lot of different interests, just like the United States is. So I don't think we should read this as kind of a new axis aligned against us. And I think the United States still has a lot of advantages in the region when it comes to China, and we don't have to compete in every sphere. I just want to say one thing on the pivot, because Amos mentioned it. It gets a lot of play. It's been talked about for years. I think some members of this administration in Washington believe they are actually executing the pivot now. The recent agreement with Australia is evidence of that. But I think, we also shouldn't exaggerate that either. There's no question across the political spectrum in Washington, there's an interest of doing less, not more in the Middle East. There's a lot of fatigue over 20 years of very costly wars with very little payoff. Afghanistan was the most recent example, tragically. So I think there is an interest in disengaging to some extent, but we also have to look at reality. The U.S. still has, give or take, about 50,000 forces in the region, still historically high levels. U.S. aid packages to partners have not changed. You have multi-billion-dollar packages, including to the UAE, to execute the Abraham Accords negotiated under Trump administration. And aid to Egypt continues, despite some debates about little bits of 130 million out of their $1.3 billion of aid over human rights, but pretty much it's business as usual. So I know there's perceptions that the U.S. is turning its back, that it's not responding to every attack. Keep in mind, Iraq is a very sensitive country, a very sensitive moment. The U.S. has to think very carefully about responding with force. Is that even what the current Iraqi government, that's quite supportive of the United States, would want? Is that in the interest of either country? I think these are big questions. So I don't think we should read the U.S. not responding to every provocation by Iran as our turning the back on the region. There's just different ways of approaching the region. Military is one tool, but it's not the only tool.
Well, we'll see how the generals who brief Amos will respond to this argument. Avner, turning to you, and again with more historical question that I find personally very interesting what you will answer. When you examine the Iranian program and the steps that they have made, and then you look at the Israeli program that you've studied so much over the years, did they learn anything from us? Can you see some things that are similar or mistakes that they learned from and executed better?
I think a great deal. They illegally translated my book and to Farsi. Somebody gave me an article.
Illegally meaning you did not get the copyright and all
without buying the copyright, without anything, just did it illegally. Somebody got me a copy. I think they've learned a great deal in their own version. They also learned a great deal from the North Korean case. And I think they would like very much to have their own case and their own precedent. I think they would like, obviously they have limitations that Israel never accepted, did not have. One is being party to the non-proliferation treaty, to the NPT. But I can see a situation that they, at one point, because of their lack of interest in getting a new deal. I mean, that's the thing that other members of this panel did not emphasize so much. I think that their interest in the deal is simply diminishing. They don't believe it served so much their interest. I think they're able to do a great deal in terms of the economy with their sanctions. And I think they realize that Biden is, which is true, is inward president, that he has less and less interest in foreign issues, definitely in the Middle East. And he is not going, unless they're going to cross the line by testing, which they're not going to do, he is really reluctant to take any actions. One thing that I can see in that kind of historical but also future-oriented context is there could be a situation that can even withdraw from the NPT and yet assign to the to the prohibition, to the treaty, to the new treaty that all the nuclear power reject and dismiss of the prohibitions of nuclear weapons. In other words, they would emphasize, we are not into acquiring nuclear weapons. We're going to sign that treaty, but we are discriminated by the NPT. The situation is different, and we are leaving the NPT. I don't think it will happen anytime soon, but I can think it's a possibility. Because one of the issues that I think they see is that the Biden administration provide much less support to the non-proliferation regime and to the issue of the NPT. He simply is less interested in that. Of course, he would like to keep it, but he is ready to take actions and to show it by deed much less, possibly even less than the Trump administration. And I think the Iranians are watching and they see all that. So I think the situation is quite dark, and I think the Iranians are having much more cards than the IC, it's not a nice situation.
And I was watching Sima nodding here, and you guys seem to be in agreement. Sima, how does Israel live with the kind of scenario that Avner just painted, where Iran doesn't have a bomb, but it's clearly a nuclear state?
I think from Israel's point of view, and not only, Iran was in weeks, as Avner has said, weeks from a bomb, is dangerous the same as if they have a bomb. It's not declared the same way, but it is dangerous the same. Because at the end of the day, what does it mean to have a military nuclear capability? It means you can threaten the other side with conventional military
you have better cards to play.
Exactly. So even being some weeks from a bomb, they don't have to pay the price that they will pay once they have a nuclear test. At the same time, they will have the same leverage vis-a-vis Israel when it comes to a conventional conflict. So I think from Israel's point of view, it is the same, and that's the reason that the difference between, one of the reasons, the difference between Israel and the US. The US is saying, we will not allow Iran to have a nuclear bomb. Israel is asking to have a commitment, we will not allow Iran to be close to the possibility to have a nuclear bomb, and this is a huge difference.
That's the whole story right there, and
yeah.
Most continuing on what Avner and Sima just described, where does the military capability of Israel stand today, as much as we can say, and how does it compare to the discussions that you described of 10 years ago?
As I mentioned, I'm not sure that Israel was that close to being capable of bombing Iranian nuclear sites and achieving something a decade ago. There was this ongoing discussion, but then at the end, both Netanyahu and Barak, who was then his defense minister, hesitated for different reasons, but no order was given to the army. Apparently, during the last 5 or 6 years, the IDF and especially the Air Force were busy with other plans and other military activity. We know that the government has decided to allocate more funds to this Iranian military option, and we know that some of the money was actually earmarked for the IDF in order for it to advance its preparations, to begin exercises and so on. This will take time. But even then, we have to look at the operational situation, which means that Iran is actually more prepared for an attack because its anti-aircraft systems have improved, and because some of these sites are now much deeper underground than they were 10 years ago. And on top of everything else, there's the strategic discussion. How will the international community react? What will this do to Israel's relationship with Western European countries, but more than anything else, with Washington? How would the Biden administration react? I think that it's not really in the cards right now.
And how would Iran react?
Yeah, of course. And maybe that's the worst. We should mention the worst last. Iran has not been building Hezbollah's military arsenal for more than 20 years, just for the sake of pleasure. I mean, this is, in the end, this is the gun that will shoot towards the end of the play. And if Israel does decide to attack, there are more than 100,000 rockets and missiles and mortar bombs that may be used against Israel. This doesn't mean the destruction of Israel. This doesn't mean the end of the Zionist state, but it will be a much more dangerous war than anything we've encountered since Yom Kippur War of 1973. So I think if Bennett or somebody after Bennett would be faced with that dilemma, he needs to consider all these aspects. And I'm not too sure that any Israeli leader would rush to a decision to strike the Iranian sites.
That's correct, but I have to also say the other side of the coin. And
Please
the
do.
other side is that it will be very difficult for any prime minister in Israel to ignore a situation where Iran is reaching the point where it will have. I mean, I agree all the reasons that were said by Amos, no question, but I think on the other side it will be very difficult. And I don't know who will be the prime minister at that time, but I think he will be. He will not want to take upon himself what Amos said at the beginning, the legacy for the future, and to be the one who allowed Iran at the end of the day to get to that point.
Well, it's the impossible dilemma for everyone. And right now what we're seeing Bennett mostly do is say, look what I inherited from Netanyahu.
Yeah.
Well, probably has a good point. Dalia, I want to go to you now and ask, continuing on the question to Amos, do the Iranians believe Israel could actually strike them?
I think so. I mean, look, Iran has been building these asymmetric capabilities, the missile arsenal that Amos referred to through Hezbollah, through its own indigenous development, its proxies, the non-state actors, not always doing what Iran would like, but still a very important lever. You see their maritime capabilities, and of course their nuclear development is not just because they want to bomb for the bomb's sake or prestige. It is another part of their asymmetric arsenal to be able to offset the overwhelming conventional superiority, including of the Israelis and certainly the Americans, and their ability to conventionally attack Iran's homeland. So it is developing all of these capabilities as a deterrent to prevent this kind of attack. So I think they do take it seriously, but I think they do feel they have enough or sufficient deterrent signaling to possibly prevent it. But I also think it's important to note that it's not like everyone's sitting on their hands waiting for this big military strike. And we've been through these military strike debates many, many times. This is like a back to the future discussion. And the reason it has not been undertaken is because of all of this political, of this strategic, political, military fallout, but also because of the very basic fact that it is not clear you can eradicate Iran's drive to nuclear capability should it decide to move in that direction for weapons through a military strike. It has the technical know-how. You certainly can set it back. But I think, and Avner can speak to this, historically, it is very difficult to bomb a program out of existence once you've gotten that kind of scientific know-how.
So we have really 1 minute left, and Avner, I want to give you the last question, exactly continuing on what Dalia said. Is there historical precedents that can give us some optimism on the ending of this story, or not at all?
Well, there is no. I mean, we're not going to have the case of South Africa. Short of change of regime in Iran, I think that Iran would continue with its desire to be closer and closer to the bomb. There is one element that we don't know, and it's an element of uncertainty, and this is the issue of cyber. What cyber can do in a non-kinetic way in terms of not just as the beginning, as the first blow for military actions, but in itself. Stuxnet was 12 years ago, more than that, and it was partially successful, not completely, and definitely bought some time. But the area of cyber is still mysterious to many, because we don't know what nations have in their arsenal, what they are planning. And it's quite possible that that could be a kind of surprise for the future. But
we'll have to wait and see. Friends, we're out of time. I want to thank you, Avner Cohen, Dalia Dasakei, Sima Shine, and Amos Oel for a fascinating discussion. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure many of our viewers as well. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello to former Foreign Minister and Justice Minister of Israel, Tzipi Livni. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Hello, Amir.
Great to have you with us. And you're joining us after an interesting visit to the Gulf that you just completed. What were you doing over there?
Well, it's a conference that naturally I cannot share the discussions there, but for me it was very touching, because I've met those that for many years I've met discreetly until the normalization with Israel. And for the first time, it's open, public, no need to hide the relationship. So it was quite moving.
You also visited some countries in that region when you were foreign minister at the time, correct?
I was once at Doha, Qatar, and it was quite, quite an interesting visit for an Israeli foreign minister that was welcomed in Doha, in Qatar, but many years passed since that time.
And a lot has changed geopolitically. When you look back at the relations that were beginning to materialize between Israel and some of these countries when you were foreign minister, and later when you were chief negotiator with the Palestinians in a different government, are you surprised that we reached the current point of normalization and open relationships?
Well, I was surprised when I heard about the Abraham Accords. I was quite happy. Because for many years we tried to promote this kind of normalization, but always the answer was the Arab Peace Initiative. First, reach an agreement with the Palestinians, and then we will normalize our relations with Israel. And for the first time, a brave, courageous decision was made to make normalization with Israel, regardless. Even just few months before that, I was invited, not in a formal position, but I was invited to Abu Dhabi, but I couldn't say that I'm there. And a few months later, it was signed as a peace treaty normalization, that it is clear now that it's going to be a warm peace. In a way unlike what we are having with Egypt and Jordan, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I heard that we've had until now about 250,000 Israelis who had already visited Dubai since the agreement with the UAE was signed, so that definitely supports what you just said. I want to ask you broadly, what do you feel was a stronger motivating factor behind these countries' decision to get closer to Israel? Was it more about the positive benefits that can arise from peace, or more about the negative threat of a common enemy, Iran and its proxies in the region?
I think it's both. For many years, it was clear that we can be and should be allies facing the threat of Iran, that is threatening not only Israel, but also Gulf states and the entire world. So it was clear that we should and need cooperate, and this is a mutual interest of Israel and Gulf states. But frankly, this kind of cooperation, or part of this cooperation, happened even before the public normalization. Therefore, I believe there was another element, and this was also the understanding that cooperation and good relations helps also not only the economy, but other aspects of life. What I heard, for example, in the last few days is that during COVID, it was also clear that cooperation in terms of health And science is needed in our region. So it was another thing that affected it. So I believe that it's altogether a combination of everything.
Do you see potential for these agreements with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, to also have some impact on the Israeli-Palestinian arena? If in the past, like you said, there was a demand of first make an agreement with the Palestinians and then you can get closer to the Arab world, can it also work the other way around, that these agreements will open the door to progress on the Palestinian track?
Well, I'll speak openly about the upside and the downside. The upside is that, of course, we are having normalization. As an Israeli, I'm quite happy about it. And maybe also it's a message for the Palestinian side. Listen, you cannot continue forever by saying no or not giving an answer to quite just agreements and drafts that were put on the table. This is the upside. But on the downside, of course, for Israelis, fruits of peace were hypothetically the relations with Gulf states, because in future agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, the average Israeli would think that we are giving land, taking calculated risks, but the risks of terror. So the main reason to do so, maybe for some, was having normalization with the Arab world. Now, as you could see, Netanyahu sold it as we can have peace for peace, which is completely nonsense when it comes to the relations between Israel and the Palestinians. So the motivation, maybe it affected also the motivation of achieving peace with the Palestinians, knowing that anyway we can have normalization without the need to achieve peace with the Palestinians. I, of course, believe that peace with the Palestinians is a pure Israeli interest and not a favor to Gulf states or the United States.
You say it's first of all for us.
But the truth, yes, of course, it's our interest, because otherwise Israel would turn into a mixed state with an ongoing conflict inside. But it is clear that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not on the agenda since the normalization. Israel passed 4 rounds of elections, and this was not on the agenda, and we have a government deciding not to touch sensitive issues, and this is the most sensitive issue. So when it comes to the need to achieve peace with the Palestinians, I am worried these days.
So I do want to ask you about that, because in your last years in the political arena, you were very strongly affiliated with pushing for a two-state solution. In the government that you were a member of at the time with Netanyahu and Yair Lapid, you were holding the file of negotiations with the Palestinians. Today, 2021, do you believe the two-state solution is still viable, still possible to reach it?
Without exaggerating, the reason for me to be in politics was the need to achieve peace. And since we are having a national conflict, I believed that the solution that was already on the table since 1947, a Jewish state and an Arab state, or a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, gives an answer to national aspiration of different peoples, Israel for the Jewish people and the Palestinian state for the Palestinian, just solution, that a win-win situation. It's not a secret that when time passes by, it became more and more problematic to achieve, more and more difficult. In 2014, I was the chief negotiator for peace. By the way, I'm the chief negotiator for peace in the last 2 rounds of negotiations with the Palestinians. And we worked with the Americans on a framework for negotiations that was offered on March 17, 2014, to Abu Mazen in his meeting with Obama in the White House, and he didn't give an answer, unfortunately. Again, he didn't give an answer.
This history that you're recounting now is exactly why some people, and we're going to hear from people who hold those views later today, say that the two-state solution, maybe it was the perfect idea, but now it's water under the bridge. What's your answer to those people?
Firstly, I hear the voices of there is no partner on the other side, and I can criticize the other side as well, but blame game doesn't help. And secondly, it is our interest. At first, we as Israelis need to decide what is our interest. And I believe that our national GPS is Jewish democratic state, secure Jewish democratic state, and in order to keep Israel as such, we need to divide the land and to separate ourselves from the Palestinians in an agreement. So if there is another solution that gives me the same answer, my vision is not about the Palestinian state, but it's about the need to keep Israel as a Jewish democratic state, hopefully in an agreement with the other side. So if somebody would put on the table another idea that gives an answer to our national aspiration as well to the national aspiration of the Palestinian, fine with me. But I cannot see another solution right now for this. So I'm not against thinking outside of the box, but as long there is no other solution, I don't want to take the solution that we are working for many years to promote, to take it off the table. And I must say that my feeling these days is that in a way we are all in a car that some of my friends from center left are quite happy that the driver is not Netanyahu, which is fine with me as well. But yet where this car is heading. And my feeling is that the car is moving slowly but surely to a one state. One state not as a solution, but as a reality. And this is something that we cannot afford and will affect the existence and the nature of Israel as a Jewish democratic state.
In general, do you see any potential for us to be surprised by this current government with the very eclectic, diverse makeup of ideologies on the Palestinian issue? Let's say, okay, Bennett said we will not evacuate settlements, there will not be a Palestinian state. What can be done to move forward under such circumstances?
I think that the most important thing is, and this I believe should be the role of the US, to put again as a destination for all of us, the two states as the compass that was there before and for a while was taken for annexation and other ideas. And then to say clearly that the support will be on actions that support this idea and that against action and policies that would make this vision more difficult to be implemented in the future. I think that there is one thing which is a huge common denominator, and this is economic or improving the economic situation on the Palestinian side, not as a replacement, not as economic peace instead of political peace, and not as a condition to something that they need to do. It's a pure Israeli interest. I believe that this government understands it, and therefore this is something that everybody can agree upon. And I hope that also this government understands that empowering the moderates on the Palestinian side, including Fatah and the PA, the Palestinian Authority, is a pure Israeli interest. And therefore I hope that this is at least something that will be done under the understanding that we need to keep the door open. We need to keep the road open if hopefully in the future we can reach a situation of negotiating and reaching an agreement.
Tzipi Livni, the former Foreign Minister and Justice Minister of Israel, thank you very much for joining us today for this discussion.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. And following the interview with former Minister Tzipi Livni, we want to continue the discussion about the Israelis and the Palestinians. And with this panel, we're going to try and solve in less than a quick hour the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Piece of cake, right? We can do this. So with me here are Amir Fakhouri, who is the director of the research center at Neve Shalom Wachat El Salam, advisor to Joint Society projects in Israel, and Gilad Sher, who is a former senior Israeli peace negotiator and chief of staff to former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and currently a fellow at the Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. And we also have, of course, Micha Goodman, who is a writer and researcher of Jewish thought, author of the best-selling book on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Catch 67. So we're going to start with you, Amir. If you could maybe, as much as you can, in approximately 10 minutes, explain to us your original solution to the conflict.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here with my revered colleagues and panelists here. It's not my solution. I'm here on behalf of the Political Initiative Two States, One Homeland, which basically advocate confederation both as a political structure and a political sentiment. And I will further elaborate on that. So basically, we advocate two states with an open borders, and it is good to remind all of us that the original partition plan was imagined as a confederation, as Jerusalem as a joined shared city, as Palestine, the state of Palestine, the state of Israel, as a monetary unit. So we advocated two independent states with an open borders, two sovereign states, two nation states. And that coming together in a shared institution to manage, which is inherently shared interest and shared national resources, material resources like aquifers and such, and we think that this structure, I guess, which reminds us of in some way the EU, can help us to find a way out of the deadlock, especially which is confined in the refugees issues and the settlements. We see the settlements as a political structure that should be treated politically, and Israeli settlers which are willing to succumb to the sovereignty of the young Palestinian state should be there, of course, in a framework of decolonization of the settlements that become, and the Israelis which there will become residents of the Palestinian state and nationals of the Israeli state, and vice versa in what concerns Palestinians refugees, and by no means I'm doing here a symmetry, which want to exercise the right of return. They will become, if they choose to, residents of Israel and nationals of the Palestinian state. So we think that structurally saying, politically and structurally wise, we think that this holistic look to the state as to the homeland, to this geopolitical unit, Israel-Palestine, can give us more spectrum of maneuver to give creative ideas. And I want to emphasize that it is based upon not only rational political structural ideas, but upon a narrative which says we have here two nations living in a close vicinity that should understand and should be educated that they cannot entertain the idea that they will live here without seeing the other nation. We should educate the young Palestinian boy and the young Israeli Jewish girl that they're here together in a shared homeland, whether they like it or not. And stemming from this existential understanding, we can build and maintain political structure and not otherwise. So this is what the two nations should be taught, that they live here with another nation, and they should try to develop their political imagination, how to share and not how to separate. There's Palestinians already. Fifth of the population of Israel is Palestinians, is Arab Palestinians. So, and I'm not going to go into the dangers of cultivating this this political imagination of separation. All of the modern world went to power sharing models to find a way out of intractable conflict. We Palestinians and Israeli Jews can find a way which stems from the sharing narrative, not the separation. And I will finish with this point. All of what I said already is already anchored in the political reality nowadays in Palestine and Israel, even under terms of Jewish superiority. We have cooperation in terms of security, in terms of aquifers, in terms of open. We have 200,000 Palestinians from the West Bank coming into Israel on a daily basis. So what we're asking, it's a natural thing. It's already anchored, and it need to perfect it. It need to be democratized.
Thank you, Amir. So, Gilad, a confederation, settlers staying in Palestine, joint institutions for a two-stater, that must all sound like a fantasy, right?
It sounds good. I mean, I'm not ruling out anything that Amir mentioned here, but I believe that first we have to deal with the core issues that are the contentious issues between Israel and the Palestinians. Then maybe later, once we have a partition of the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea into two nation states, then we can proceed towards any kind of structure that looks like confederation or other structures that were mentioned in the public debate about that. I believe that, looking at the objectives of the national security of Israel and the long-term objectives of Israel, I believe that the only way to secure Israel as the democratic nation state of the Jewish people is by separating itself from of the Palestinians, and for the Palestinians to have their statehood with self-determination in a state of their own. It's the only way to have a border between the two nation states. Now we are 14 million people, Israelis and Palestinians. That's all between on this piece of land, and we have to first divorce. Then we might engage in a different path. I believe that when I was at the Institute for National Security Studies, we used to once a year look at all the structures and all the initiatives and all the plans that were on the table at that point in time, analyze them according to a certain set of parameters, and year after year after year, the two-state solution got by far the best rating in this research. Now, why is that? Look, there's the status quo.
Both Israelis and Palestinians, by the way.
Yes.
Those surveys.
Yes, but of course, I mean, I'm talking as an Israeli Jew. And I'm looking at my Declaration of Independence of 1948 as my, more or less my Bill of Rights, my Constitution, that's what I'm looking for. You know, the kind of universal values with the Israel being the nation state of the Jewish people, and all together combined in a set of semi-constitutional set of values. So I look at the status quo, or even at management of the conflict, which is often mentioned as the way to proceed. You know, you don't have to take any decision. You don't have to demonstrate any kind of leadership. You just manage the conflict. But the truth of the matter is that there's no such thing as managing a conflict. The conflicts usually manages the conflict manages the parties that are in dispute, and we see it throughout history, and even during these very days. So this will probably not be, you know, the two-state solution is probably only a vehicle to lead towards a better future for Israelis and Palestinians. But and it doesn't have to be a one-off, standalone, you know, permanent status agreement according to certain parameters, be it the Clinton parameters or the Annapolis ones. You know, very few rounds of real negotiations on permanent status that we had in the last 3 decades. Perhaps 10% of the time we were negotiating permanent status. But along the parameters, more or less, I would suggest addressing this as an attempt to change the trend that is currently leading towards a disastrous one-state solution, binational state. This is disastrous for Israelis and for Palestinians alike. So reverse the trend towards a gradual advancement towards a two-state reality and preserving the conditions that would allow a two-state solution to come up at a certain point in time without negating the final agreement that might be attained. So first, it should be a gradual process. Second, it should be a three-pronged approach process. Regional, you know, we can capitalize on whatever happens in the region, and with our allies and the two countries that have long ago signed agreements of peace with us, Egypt and Jordan, and other developments of the last year or two with the Abraham Accords, etc. So capitalize on that. Then bilateral negotiations. We need to discuss whatever happens, and we need an international. I wouldn't say supervisor, but at least a kindergarten kind of body, perhaps the quartet, perhaps others, you know, that would lock us in a room and allow us to discuss whatever divergences we have, and we do have a lot of divergences, including within our internal domestic constituencies, each one of us. But at least whatever is agreed or mutually coordinated would be implemented. And then, little by little, you build layer over layer of, you pave the way towards an ultimate possible two-state solution. Then you can do whatever you want. You can confederate, you can whatever, okay? So I believe that this is it's always not the time for this kind of major decisions. But if you do it gradually, then these are not so major decisions that you have to have to be taken. So I'm also looking for ways to change the mindsets of the people of this region towards making peace. You know, we plan a lot of clashes, wars, all kind of violent, different degrees of violence and violent conflict between us. And so we plan it, and there's military planning. There's let's plan peace. Let's plan peace once and for all.
Thank you, Gilad. And Micha, working on your book, you must have, spoken to many people, hearing these approaches two-state solution and the, newest confederation idea, but you came to a different conclusion.
That's right. That's right. My conclusion is called shrinking the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That'd be dramatically shrinking the conflict, but assuming conflict is here to stay. And to understand this paradigm of shrinking the conflict, I think there's two main things we have to understand. One, what's a paradigm shift? And two, how do we tap into the invisible Israeli consensus? I'll move from the first to the second, okay? So what's the paradigm shift? I really enjoyed listening to Amir and to Gilad, and they presented what Gilad called what's the ultimate end game? How does it end? What's the solution to the conflict? So there's a basic assumption here that the Holy Grail is end to conflict. Gilad also mentioned the alternative. The alternative is managing the conflict. Now, if ending the conflict is a transformation of the status quo, managing the conflict is freezing the status quo. Now, here's my question. Are those the two options we have? Is that true? I just want to notice that we don't think that way about any problem we deal with in life. Take COVID, for example. Yes, I think New Zealand and Australia had this fantasy of no COVID, zero COVID, to put an end to COVID. And I think they failed. I think they failed. Most countries said, we can't put an end to COVID. But when they realized that we can't put an end to COVID, did they start ignoring COVID? Neglecting COVID? Most countries are trying to figure out a strategy to shrink COVID. When it comes to car accidents, no one is saying let's put an end to car accidents, and the alternative to putting an end to car accidents is not ignoring car accidents. Crime, no one says let's put an end to crime, and no one says let's ignore crime. When it comes to real problems, we don't try to end them, we don't ignore them, we try to shrink them. That's what we think about most problems, and then there's a conflict. And either we're messianic or indifferent. End it or ignore it, manage it, freeze it. Let's think about the conflict like we think about COVID, car accidents, and crime. Let's stop ending it. Let's stop managing it. Those are not the only options. It's a false dichotomy, the illusion there's only two options. If we think about this problem like we think about any problem in the world, we'll come to a conclusion that we have to shrink it. But what does it mean to shrink it? What does it mean to shrink the size of the conflict? To explain this and why I think shrinking the conflict is possible, because I think it's an approach that taps in to what most people don't know, that most Israelis agree. Not all Israelis agree. But there is an invisible, Israel is so polarized and divided and angry at each other that polarization is hiding, it's masking an invisible Israeli agreement. And it's a paradoxical agreement. Here's how it goes. Most Israelis do not want to control the lives of Palestinians. The fact that in the West Bank there's a military regime controlling a civilian population in different levels is something that not all Israelis, but most Israelis don't like that. They feel like it's unethical, not Jewish, not Zionistic, and it's a threat. It's a threat to the future of Israel as a Jewish state, Jewish democracy, like Gilad said. At the same time, and probably with more passion and more emphasis, most Israelis are afraid. They're afraid that a withdrawal would put Israel under serious threat. So here's what most Israelis agree on. They don't want to control the Palestinians. They're afraid of any move that would put them under threat of Palestinians. It's a problem. I would say a great visualization of this paradoxical agreement of most Israelis is horrible May. I think we could all agree this last May was a very low moment in the history of Israel. And we saw two things in May. One, rockets on Tel Aviv. Two, Lod, civil war in Lod. So some people,
and Akko and Jaffa.
And Akko and Jaffa and Ramle.
To remind us.
That's right. I know, that's true. I'm saying they'll just have a powerful image, but yeah, it was all over the place. And then when we saw Lod, so many Israelis say, wow, if a binational city doesn't work, will a binational state work? People looking at Lod and saw, if Israel stays in the West Bank, Eventually, Israel turns into Lod. Israel is a binational state. We don't want that. At the same time, Israelis looking at Tel Aviv. And they're saying, well, Tel Aviv, for 1 week, has the feel and taste of what it means to be a resident of Sderot, very close to Gaza, all year. So Israelis were saying, if we leave the West Bank, Tel Aviv will be Sderot. If we stay in the West Bank, Israel will be Lod. These are two catastrophes that most Israelis want to avoid. Again, Israelis don't want to control the lives of Palestinians, and yet they're afraid of a withdrawal that will put them under the threat of a failed state in the West Bank. And there is good reasons to believe that a Palestinian state will be a failed state. Look at Gaza, look at other presidents. So how do you tap in, how do you turn this paradoxical, invisible Israeli consensus? How do you do that? Well, there's no real alchemy here, but here's shrinking the conflict is the following. These are steps on the ground, maybe unilateral, maybe based on local agreements that dramatically shrink the amount that Israelis control the lives of Palestinians without decreasing the amount of security that Israelis enjoy. To control the Palestinians a lot less without being threatened from them more. What does it look like? Am I out of time?
No, it's okay.
Okay, what does it really look like? These are steps right now. The lived reality in the West Bank is like this. There's over 160 Palestinian autonomous islands that are not connected to each other. Every island has an autonomy, but they're not connected to each other because in between this Area C is area controlled by the IDF, by the Israeli Defense Forces.
60%.
What?
60%.
60% of the land, that's right.
Yep.
So that means that the amount of self-governance of the Palestinian Authority is extremely low. Mm-hmm. There's another problem, by the way, that there's over 160 autonomous islands. They're not connected. They have no way to go abroad in a sovereign way. They're in an airport or a port in the ocean, in the sea. A second problem is that they can't really do their own planning and zoning. There's just not enough land around their villages and towns. A third problem is because of the Paris Protocol, I won't go into a lot of details, but the Palestinian economy is not an independent economy. It's very much dependent on Israel. Let's take care of all
those. Israel is occupying.
Yes. So here's the question. I think Israel, without an ultimate solution, could solve all three problems, which means, roughly, connecting Palestinian autonomous islands to each other, connecting them to the world, expanding towns and cities so they could have planning and zoning, and liberating their economy.
Okay,
now,
so without,
let me tell you something.
Let me just end here. Just 1 minute. Let me just conclude.
On this point, okay.
After the Palestinians are connected to each other, connected to the world, and independent economically, the conflict doesn't end. It doesn't end. Okay. All that happens is the following. They have more self-governance, and Israel doesn't have less security. That is shrinking the conflict, and here's the thing. Let's do that tomorrow morning. Let's not wait for the conditions for peace. Let's do that tomorrow morning.
Okay, so that's on shrinking the conflicts. Gilad,
I wanted to,
conflict.
The two core issues that were never a major problem are territory and security. Those are the one that Micha tackles. Okay, so in the negotiations on permanent status, okay, territory, borders, settlements, security arrangements, demilitarization of Palestine, etc., were never the sticking points of the negotiations. And I believe that when you have a picture, that demonstrates the end game, does not negate what you suggest.
Because you were talking about a gradual process, and you're talking about a gradual process without calling the end.
But you have to resolve the conflict, and eventually you have to resolve.
Just a second. I want for a second ask Amir, because I saw you were moving inconveniently in your chair during Zmicha's presentation.
You interpreted me correctly.
And I wanted to ask you. First of all, my feeling was that I think both gentlemen were talking very much from an Israeli point of view, and they said so. Which the conflict, of course, has another side. And the other thing is, I think in Micha's presentation, we heard a lot about steps that are necessary from your point of view on the ground, but not a lot about what you mentioned, which is nationality and the narrative and, you know, the psychology of the conflict, which does involve an end game.
That's right. First of all, narratives are not only psychological; they're anchored in the national sentiments of both sides. But you were correct. I was moving inconveniently because I'm afraid that the eloquent presentation of my friend here is based upon very problematic premises, and I will explain. First and foremost, my friend here, and I'm afraid so, is utterly neglecting the international law. Does international law allow Israel as an occupying force to shrink occupation? There's no shrinking occupation. It's a matter of human rights. And the second premise, I'm not sure if this eloquent equation include Palestinian will. Did you ever ask Palestinian representatives, do you agree to shrinking occupation? I'm guessing he will tell you, do not shrink occupation, just get out of my land, according to international law, the same international law that you derive legitimacy into your state. So you can't conduct a conversation about the Palestinians' situation while regarding Palestinians. And to this extent, you can't conduct a conversation on this conflict from only internal Israeli perspective. And this is what enables that. This is the power stances. What enables such interpretation, and I'm fully sure that it comes from good intentions, that Micha and my Jewish Israeli co-citizens feel enough indulged with power to entertain a conversation about Palestinians' destiny without Palestinians in this political imagination. Palestinians, the vast majority of them, do not want you to shrink. They want, as any nation, they want sovereignty. Okay, it will be in a progressive, incremental way. I think it is a legitimate methodological way of thinking. But first and foremost, any solution should be anchored not only in a political, in a real politique way. It should be anchored in international law. And your equation lacks any reference to international law, and it should be anchored only in the. It should be addressed the grievousness of the occupied people.
Okay, Micha, you'll get an opportunity definitely to answer that. But first, Gilad, because I think you will probably also...
Yeah, I'd like to make three very brief points. The first one is that this kind of shrinking the conflict and managing it, this kind of approach, I'm concerned that some of the trends that are currently worrying us would be irreversible by not moving towards something that is more than just managing or shrinking or handling the conflict.
But again, because you're talking about the gradual process, he's talking about the gradual process.
Right. So
the difference is that you point at the end game, which is two states, and you think that is important in the gradual process. Why is that? Because
I would like to
need
see
a vision of the end?
I need the vision of the end of two nation states with a borderline between them, with a sufficient I would say, resolution of, and satisfactory resolution of the core contentious issues: Jerusalem, the holy sites, the old city, refugees, the the settlements, borders, territory, and security arrangements. All these should be resolved at a certain point in time. You cannot, and because at a certain point in time, if we do not move towards that objective, then some of the trends might be reversible. The second point is the paradox about security, that the fear is, or the concern is that once there is a Palestinian state, then Israel would be threatened by it. And I happen to be the chairman of the executive board of Sapir Academic College, situated 2 miles from the border of Gaza. And I'm telling you that that across the Gaza envelope, villages, towns, and cities, there is a vast majority for an agreement with the Palestinians, not for continuing the status quo, not for continuing to manage the conflict. Number 3, independent steps are needed. Independent steps that are in line with an eventual 2-state solution that contribute to either the negotiations or to the situation on the ground, such as, for instance, differentiating between those settlements that will be part and parcel of Israel once the borderline the boundaries are delineated. That's about 75 to 80% of the settlers that are living adjacent.
Okay, so that's an interesting point, because you're saying without the end goal, then which gradual steps are we actually taking? So, Micha, there are 2 claims here. So the first, Amir is saying you're not even taking into consideration the Palestinian will in this story. And Gilad also says, it's very important what is your end goal, because that, in the end describes also the steps that you're taking towards it.
Okay. Is that our time? You have 6 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. And I probably have less time in that, right?
And of course, the reference to
so I'll try to respond very briefly, very quickly, and obviously I won't be able to respond to everything you said. Yes, of course. Any solution needs to be anchored in international law. What I'm offering is not a solution. It's not a solution. But it's a way to break the status quo, to break the frozen reality, and to move forward and to reduce suffering. I want to notice something. Over 20 years, the situation in the West Bank has been frozen. By the way, the fact that politically it's frozen doesn't mean that the trends on the ground are frozen. A lot of suffering.
It's frozen for Palestinians that suffer every day.
Exactly.
Expropriation. It's not frozen.
Exactly. Only politically it's frozen. Now here's the big question. Why has it been frozen? Why was there no initiative for more than 20 years? Well, here's why. If any step needs measured by the question, will this end the conflict? Well, if it doesn't end the conflict, we're not doing it. If it doesn't lead to complete independence, to complete resolution of the conflict, so the step is off the table. So here, there is a concern that I agree with, that the settlement movement its ideology is freezing the status quo. I think also the peace ideology is freezing the status quo also. I'll try to explain why. Because if any step on the ground, like connecting autonomous islands to each other, connecting them to the world, changing reality on the ground, if any step depends on a peace agreement, I'm afraid that peace agreement that's not coming means no steps on the ground. So if any step depends on peace...
No, it's the other way around.
Peace, let me just finish here, yes? Peace that's not coming means no steps on the ground, so the myth of peace is freezing the status quo, just like the myth of settlements. So shrinking the... Now, towards your question about endgame, is it true that a withdrawal from the West Bank risks Israeli security? Does it risk Israeli security? It's an academic, and it's an important question. I just want to notice, most Israelis think that it does risk Israeli security, and that is why endgame rhetoric doesn't tap into the broad Israeli consensus, and without the broad Israeli consensus, it's very hard to make progress and to move forward. Here's the thing. I want to speak one last thing about endgame, okay? Once Israel takes initiative, with Palestinians, with local agreements, with Palestinians. And by the way, the Palestinians have to make a decision, yes? Israel was formed by the sum of small steps. David Ben-Gurion started building Israel from the bottom up.
Okay, we
increasing.
definitely do not have time for the history
Okay,
of Israel.
increasing self-governance until it was a state. Yes, I'm not saying Palestinians need to support Zionism, not at all. I'm saying Palestinians need to be like Zionism. It's a very successful movement, being like Zionism, building their sovereignty bottom up, shrinking the conflict enables exactly that. And finally, once Israel connects the autonomous islands to each other, connects them to the world, liberates their economy, we can speak about a real autonomy here. Not a state, but it's what Israeli general Giora Eiden calls critical mass of self-governance. Once you have that, well, it fits into many endgames. One endgame, two-state. Second endgame, confederation. Third endgame, confederation with Jordan. Fourth endgame, Begid's autonomy. It fits into multiple endgames. Right now, we thought we have to agree on the endgame to play the game. I'm saying let's not agree on the endgame, only agree on the game, and then we can move forward.
Maybe you should have called it unfreeze the status quo instead of shrinking the conflict, which is causing maybe the conflict, no? Whatever. Okay, ending remarks, Gilad and Amir.
So I say that there's not much difference between what we all speak about, and the question is, how do you go about that? How do you start moving towards any direction when you're not negotiating, there's no process of any kind of dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians for quite a long time, since 2014, I think, last time that were any kind of talks.
Well, we had a couple of meetings recently,
yes,
which are not really
but
negotiations.
these are photo-op meetings. These are not negotiations. You negotiate every day, day in, day out. My final suggestion is this: when I negotiated in Camp David, in Taba, etc., and all the covert negotiations, we always had this paradigm or this formula of nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, which of course blocks the way towards a full-fledged agreement. I believe that we need to change that. And here I agree with Micha. Whatever is agreed or mutually coordinated or independently suggesting a preservation of a two-state solution should be implemented. That changes the mindsets of the people. It is visible on the ground, and it leads towards a better reality. We need to move from reality A of the conflict to reality B of moving towards ending the conflict, even if we do not end it immediately, and there's no feasibility for that right now. So that's my proposal to kind of link the three of us into one way that we could move forward.
So we're not going to end the conflict. That's already, I think, pretty sure. But
Micha doesn't want to end the conflict.
Right, we're not going to shrink or end it. But we are going to end the panel. So
as a final remark, you know what? Theoretically speaking, there is no wrong in thinking about ending conflicts or even managing conflict in an incremental way, gradual way. But again, there is no need for theory here. We're here after 100 years of conflict, and we saw when we say gradual or let us if not or not agree on that, let us proceed. Proceeding is deepening the occupation, deepening the Palestinian suffer. What has not been agreed upon has become even more aggravated. So this theory of graduality should be, of course, anchored in a certain history. And the second and last remark, which is impeding the ending of the apartheid regime and occupation in the West Bank, are not peace initiatives and not the thinking that the Israeli military occupation should end tomorrow. This is not impeding peace.
Regardless of an agreement.
Regardless of that, it should end according again to international law, and this should be emphasized again and again. What is impeding peace is the Jewish-Israeli superiority ideology that most of the Israelis, unfortunately, the vast majority of the Israelis indulge. And they indulge a sentiment of superiority because they can, because the power relation enables them. So if we want peace to become, if they want to end Palestinian suffering, we should think how to legitimize the rising of Palestinian power, and we should think in power relation terms, and not only in this. This is another critical paradigm shift that should be embraced.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank you all for coming here, of course, but also for keeping this discussion alive. It's not so trivial these days. So thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Noah.
Thank you.
And we're back, and we're saying hello to Transportation Minister, member of the Israeli Security Cabinet, and chairwoman of the Labour Party, Merav Michaeli.
Hello, Amir.
Great to have you with us in the Haaretz UCLA conference.
Thank you for having me.
And let's get right to the difficult issues. Talks with Iran are renewing these days, the United States talking to Tehran. We saw in the past a previous Israeli prime minister take a very confrontational approach when the Obama administration was negotiating with Tehran. What should we expect from the government that you are now a member of?
Israel needs to be concerned about the nuclear bottom line. That is what we should care about and what we should work about and for. And what we need to do is work very, very closely with the US and our other allies. Work very closely and discreetly, as opposed to what previous governments and prime ministers have done. Not go to the media, not go to Congress to make speeches, but work very closely across all the line of the chain of command from bottom to top, and worry about the bottom line.
And what is the bottom line that we're concerned? Stopping Iran from having nuclear weapons at all costs?
I don't know what all costs is, and I don't like speaking about all costs. I like speaking about the target. What is it that we want to achieve? And it's not an Israeli issue. And we need to go back to speaking about the fact that Iran as a nuclear state is a problem of the world. It's not an Israeli problem. We need to go back to having the international community working towards preventing from Iran having a nuclear weapon, because it is a hazard for world peace, for stability of the region. It's not an Israeli issue, and it should be dealt as an international issue.
We saw already Prime Minister Bennett in the summer going to the White House to meet President Biden. We just saw a visit by Rob Malley, the president's envoy for Iran here in Israel. Do you feel that there is a good line of communication right now between this government and the White House on Iran?
I think there's good communication between this government and the White House, period, on everything, and that is exactly how it should be. The relationship with the US is a major Israeli strategic interest, and that we should go back to investing in it. Going back to investing in bipartisanship, one of the major assets that we used to have for so many years and is now has been shaken, and we need to go back to investing in that, exactly in that.
So when you look today at the situation in Congress, we saw over the summer the crisis that was then solved over Iron Dome. You're concerned that we're looking at more hazards like this along the way?
It's not, it's not a specific national security per se when it comes to weapons or to arms or anything of the sort. It's about the relationship. It's about sharing the same values, working together towards what I think both countries are invested in: democracy, a more just society. Yes, peace and security, but not only, again, for Israel, but we have many partners that need to be concerned about that, and that is something that US and Israel should be working on together.
How can this government bring back the perception that Israel is strongly committed to bipartisanship? Because there has been criticism in Washington in recent years that at least under the previous government, Israel was seemingly taking sides in American politics.
I was, part of this
upfront
criticism.
talking about this.
Certainly, and I think it's very clear today in this government that bipartisanship is an asset that we must restore and must invest in. I think it's very, very clear. We have a president who is a very strong Israel supporter. There's a state of Israel that understands the relationship's importance. And again, it's a matter of political will. And the political will in this government is certainly there.
What about the relationship specifically with the American Jewish community? Because you guys also took office after a long period when that relationship was cracking, and we saw a lot of anger coming from the American side about some decisions that were made here and others that were made and delayed, like, for example, the Western Wall compromise.
Exactly.
What kind of change can we expect on that front?
First of all, Labor took deliberately, we took upon ourselves this ministry that is, we don't like it to call it...
Diaspora affairs.
Yes, we don't like to call it diaspora, we like to call it the global Jewish world, actually.
I like the reasoning you present here.
Yes, no, completely. It's a global Jewish world out there that we feel a strong relation to, and we want to enhance this connection with them. And this is why we took it upon ourselves, and we have Nachman Shai, who has so much experience and also really is invested in this very strongly. So one of the things that we are pushing forward, and it's part of our coalition agreement, is the Western Wall compromise.
To go back to it.
It is a compromise. It is not what I think should be taking place in the Western Wall, but at least this compromise must be pushed forward. We are already working on a resolution that will be, I hope, passed in the government.
You see the other partners going along with this, with you guys?
I heard Lieberman's commitment to it. I heard Lapid's commitment to it. And as I mentioned, we are signed in a coalition agreement with Lapid on that. So I see no... And also, I have to tell you, Amir, I really see none of the partners to this government opposing such a compromise. Mm-hmm. It is so long overdue that it's up to us to make it happen now.
We'll obviously keep watching because it's a major priority for a lot of our readers. I want to ask you now on the Palestinian arena. We are looking right now at an interesting situation where there are different voices within the same government. And obviously that also reflects on Washington. For example, the debate about the American consulate in Jerusalem. How do you square that circle?
You know, Labor, I decided that we... our partners for forming this government, not lightly, because I knew that this will probably not be the government that will bring about the much-needed solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. At the same time, my commitment is to make sure that this government does not allow to preclude a future solution with the Palestinians. And this is what we must work for constantly. So we must find constantly a compromise within the government that allows us, on one hand, unfortunately, to maintain a quote-unquote status quo, and on the other hand, maintain it so we maintain a prospect for a future solution.
So at least the door is not shut.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. We must keep the door open for a future arrangement with the Palestinians. This is a national security interest for Israel. It's for its future, for its sustainability, for everything. We are committed to that, and we will continue working for it.
That's in the long term. On the day-to-day level, though, we do see that there has been some, I don't want to say tension, but at least discussion openly with the Americans about some of the practical arrangements, whether it's the consulate, whether it's building in the settlements. Do you feel there is pressure to see a different course coming from Washington right now?
I never expect foreigners to put pressure on us to do the right thing. And an Israeli legislature and an Israeli minister, certainly do not turn to others in order to help me to do what needs to be done. I have spoken loudly and clearly against building in the settlements. This is something that this government should not be doing. This government, again, will not evacuate anyone, but cannot expand settlements and cannot endanger Israel's future regarding a future solution with the Palestinians.
What about opportunities? We're talking about threats and dangers, but there are also opportunities in the region. Do you expect the administration with this government maybe to expand on what we saw beginning under the previous American administration, the Abraham Accords, maybe add other countries to the mix?
The potential is huge. The potential is there. You mentioned the Abraham Accords, yes, with, of course, countries and states that are far away from us and yet again very interested in the relationship and the joint interests. But I am focusing on the potential that we have here. Egypt and Jordan.
Next door neighbors.
Next door neighbors whose relationship that we have with them and that we have had, and the agreements that we have with them are foundations to Israel's national security these days. Now, the previous prime minister has alienated Jordan and damaged the relationship with it dramatically. I am working very much in order to use whatever tools we have to enhance and to strengthen those relationships and this connection. And in the transport ministry, thankfully, I have many ways in which I can and I will be doing this.
This is something that I think to many of our viewers is unrecognized. Can you give one or two practical examples, short, that demonstrate the potential here?
There are, first of all, we are, as you said, they're neighbors. We can transportation is part of national. Maybe we need to start by saying how transportation is part of national security in the sense that national security is not only about army.
I think President Biden, with his infrastructure package, would agree with you. Maybe this is the talking point he's been looking for.
Exactly. So certainly transportation is part of national security, and certainly when it comes to relationship with neighbors. It's about not only about getting from one place to another safely and effectively, and not only about being able to move whatever commerce and stuff around, but about being able to get to where we want in life. And where we want to get in life is having a strengthened relationship, a fruitful relationship with our very close partners and neighbors, so we can help the stability of the region, so we can help the future potential for more relationship, and of course for other solutions that we all need so much.
One issue that for a lot of supporters of Israel abroad, especially in the United States, has been a top priority in recent years is BDS, the prospect of boycotts on Israel, isolations of Israelis in all kinds of arenas. Where do you think the government can bring a change on that front? What should we try to do in order to address this problem and maybe do differently than previous politicians who tried to deal with it?
Yet again, one of the reasons why we took the Ministry for Global Jewish World and for the relationship with outside world, the world outside of Israel. There are two things. One is explaining things differently, and the other is doing things differently.
Which component is more important in dealing with the threat?
Both of them are extremely important, and I think it's very clear already that this government speaks in a very different language, without hatred, without incitement, without violence. It tries to find compromises all the time. It tries to include everyone. And I think the relationship that this government demonstrates towards the Arab society in Israel, for instance, the huge money that's being invested now.
Having an Arab party as a member of the coalition.
For the first time ever, an Arab party is part of the coalition. It's something that really you cannot exaggerate in its importance. I think both internally, first and foremost, of course, for the state of Israel, but also as something that really shows, I think, to the outside world that this is a government that really sees things and does things differently.
Maybe also a different image in that sense.
Yes, both.
But specifically, for example, one thing that happened is that the government shut down the Strategic Affairs Ministry that was supposed to deal with it. You think, in retrospect, after a few months, this was the right decision?
The strategic sort of whatever ministry was a political invention. The ministry that is supposed to deal with it is the Foreign Ministry and the Global Jewish World Ministry. Those are the ministries that have to deal with that, and I am certain that they will be doing it. At least one I know that will be doing it much better now.
The one we'll have to wait and see.
The one that's under my and our responsibility.
Merav Michaeli, Minister of Transportation, member of the Security Cabinet, and chairwoman of the Israeli Labor Party. Thank you very much for joining us today for the conference.
Pleasure being here, and good luck.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion on the future of the alliance between the United States and Israel. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA. It's a great pleasure for me to be moderating this panel discussion, featuring some of the leading experts on the US-Israel relationship. Over the past decade, there have been many ups and downs in US-Israel relations. The relationship has swung from the bickering and backbiting between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu to the bromance between President Trump and Netanyahu. How are US-Israel relations changing under the Biden administration and the Bennett-Lapid government? And what challenges to the relationship will President Biden and Prime Minister Bennett have to contend with? Of course, it's not only these two leaders who will shape US-Israel relations over the next few years. The US Congress will also play a key role in this relationship. In that respect, Democratic members of Congress, currently in the majority in the Senate and the House, will be in the spotlight as attention has focused on progressive Democrats who have been outspoken in criticizing Israel and are increasingly willing to apply pressure on Israel's government. Will there continue to be strong bipartisan support for Israel in Congress, as there has been for decades now? The future of American support for Israel won't only be determined on Capitol Hill and in the White House. The opinions of ordinary Americans will also shape the extent and nature of this support. Are Americans just as supportive of Israel as they've been for decades? Or is American public opinion towards Israel changing? And if so, how? Historically, no group of Americans has been as supported and as invested in the US-Israel relationship as Jewish Americans have been. But for some time now, their attitudes have been changing towards Israel, and their criticisms of its government's policies have been growing. How will this development impact the US-Israel relationship? To answer these critical questions, we have an extremely knowledgeable panel I'm delighted to now introduce. Ambassador Martin Indyk is a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a former US ambassador to Israel, Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, and Special Assistant to President Clinton. Ambassador Indyk also served as President Obama's Special Envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations from July 2000 to June 2004. He is the author of Innocent Abroad, an intimate account of American peace diplomacy in the Middle East, co-author of Bending History, Barack Obama's Foreign Policy, and his latest book is Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy. Congressman Robert Wexler is the president of the S. Daniel Abraham Center for Middle East Peace in Washington, D.C. He was a Democratic member of Congress from 1997 to 2010, representing Florida's 19th district in the House of Representatives. During his time in Congress, Congressman Wexler served as a senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and a member of the Middle East Subcommittee. In 2008, he served as an advisor on Middle East and Israel issues to President Obama during his presidential campaign. And in 2012, he addressed the Democratic National Convention outlining President Obama's policies towards Israel. Professor Shibli Telhami is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He regularly conducts public opinion polls in the Arab world, Israel, and the United States. Among his many publications are The World Through Arab Eyes, Arab Public Opinion, and the Reshaping of the Middle East, The Peace Puzzle, America's Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace, and The Stakes, America in the Middle East. And finally, Dr. Shira Efron is a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, a special advisor on Israel with the RAND Corporation, and a policy advisor with Israel Policy Forum. And Dr. Efron's research focuses on US policy toward the Middle East. So I'd like to begin by asking Ambassador Indyk, first of all, what do you think the impact of the Biden administration and the Bennett-Lapid government will be on US-Israel relations? Do you think the honeymoon period is now over and that tensions between the two sides are beginning to surface? And if so, can these tensions be kept behind closed doors, as both sides seem to hope?
Thanks, Dov, and I'm delighted to be with you for this discussion with my friends. Tension in relations between states is not something that should be considered a Gewalt type situation. It happens on a regular basis. Just look at the tensions we've had between the United States and France recently. And it particularly happens between the United States and Israel from time to time because of the nature of the circumstances in which each country finds itself. Israel is a small, although now powerful state in a volatile region. And the United States is a superpower that has interests across the globe. Inevitably, the priorities of each are going to be different from time to time. And the notion that there can be no daylight between the United States and Israel is a fiction created by, I think, people who wanted to make it unacceptable for the United States to pursue its own interests and only to follow Israel. So I just think that's unrealistic. There's no historical precedent for such a thing. And we shouldn't assume that the relationship will break just because there are differences from time to time. The question is how to manage them. So even though you have within the Lapid-Bennett government on the one side and the Biden administration on the other, a desire to get past the tensions that characterize the relations between previous Democratic administrations and Likud governments. That is to say, more liberal Democratic administrations and more right-wing Likud governments. Today, I think there's a desire both to avoid those kinds of tensions and to rebuild a more positive and constructive relationship. But there are going to be differences today. There's difference over the question of reopening the US consulate in Jerusalem, for instance. And we should expect that there will be some tension over that. There'll be tension inevitably over settlement policy. There always has been, always will be, because that's against US interests. And yet successive Israeli governments of left and right, not just this hybrid version, continue to pursue settlement activity. So I think that we're going to see overall a better way of dealing with the problems because both sides are committed to trying to work together, as opposed to under Netanyahu, who was looking to pursue a partisan approach, appealing to the Republicans at the expense of the Democrats. Clearly, Lapid and Bennett are not interested in that kind of approach. They're much more focused on bipartisanship. And so I think that overall, the relationship will be strong, positive, and that will create a much better context for dealing with the inevitable strains and differences that will arise.
Thank you. So in many ways, the harmonious period between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu was the aberration rather than the rule of US-Israel relations. I'd like to turn to you, Congressman Wexler. There's been a lot of, Ambassador Indyk used the word Gewalt. There's been a lot of Gewalt recently over attitudes toward Israel in Congress, and particularly within the Democratic Party, and a kind of, a fear that Democrats are turning against Israel. What do you make of this claim? I mean, how do you see trends, if anything, both within Congress, but specifically within the Democratic Party?
Sure, and thank you for having me. I don't think there's any legitimate fear, as you say, in terms of Democrats somehow moving away from Israel. And the vote most recent in the House of Representatives regarding additional funding for Iron Dome was overwhelming. Both Republicans and Democrats supporting roughly $1 billion of additional funding for a defensive missile defense system for Israel. Having said that, though, for those of us who care deeply about the American-Israeli relationship and the crucial bipartisan foundation of that relationship, there is a change in the debate, particularly amongst the Democratic Party, and largely forced to the surface by a group of progressives within the party. And what is that debate? I would suggest the debate is anchored in the realization that no longer is a negotiated two-state solution an assumed outcome. And that is a product of both Israelis and Palestinians, to a certain degree, moving away from an assumption of a negotiated two-state outcome, and also failures of repeated efforts to reach conclusions. And to a certain degree, the Trump administration, for the first time, any Republican or Democratic administration, overtly moving away from a negotiated two-state outcome as the preferred goal. So Democrats are in this awkward position. We used to know what we were for when it came to Israel. We were for a robust security relationship with our strategic ally. We were for a negotiated two-state outcome that would ensure that Israel would remain democratic and a Jewish majority and secure. But now we no longer know that a two-state outcome is viable. So Democrats don't know necessarily what they're for, but to a large degree, they know what they are uncomfortable with. And as Ambassador Enrich pointed out, many Democrats, Republicans too, are uncomfortable with an unbridled settlement policy. To a certain degree, people are uncomfortable at certain aspects of a housing demolition policy in Israel that appears at times to be harsh or directed in an improper direction. And generally speaking, Democrats, although Republicans also, but Democrats tend to be more vocal about rights. And when they perceive that there may be a deprivation or an inequality of rights, they will speak to that. But the good news is, and this is what I think is the overriding message, the good news is that the Biden administration has an opportunity to define quite clearly what Democrats, what Americans should be for relative to Israel, and particularly relative to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what we should be for at this point is improving conditions, improving lives for Israelis and Palestinians alike, and where we can, to narrow the political differences between the two parties. That's what we can do today to build a two-state reality in the absence of diplomatic or political progress. We can do it by creating territorial contiguity, more territorial contiguity for Palestinians, transportation contiguity for Palestinians. The Israeli government, the new government, has already started issuing more work permits. They've recognized inside Israel some Bedouin towns, very important messaging. And they've also devoted millions, hundreds of millions of funding to Israeli Arab communities inside Israel, also very important messaging. And the Israeli Supreme Court offered a constructive compromise with respect to the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. The real opportunity, and I'll close with this, is taking the extraordinary opportunity of the Abraham Accords, negotiated, of course, to the credit of the Trump administration, but taking the normalization process and including the Palestinians in it in a way that they've not been included thus far. And it is not difficult to imagine, with a good deal of American diplomatic effort, that we could be entering into a time where we have constructive business relationships between Israelis and Palestinians and Emiratis and Moroccans and business people from Bahrain in Israeli-controlled areas of the West Bank that open up new opportunities. Just this last week, we had a military exercise between the United States, Israel, Bahrain, and the UAE. A wonderful, wonderful, in my view, message to Iran of solidarity, but also this exercise of strength should allow the Israeli government, the United States, and our partners in the region to include the Palestinians in the good news in terms of the benefits of the Abraham Accords.
Thank you. I want to return to some of those policy measures in a moment, but I'd like to widen the focus now out from inside the Beltway and the kinds of policies that the United States can adopt to think about public opinion in the United States. And I want to turn to Professor Telhami, who's studied American public opinion so extensively. Do you see American public support for Israel as fundamentally stable? Or do you see it shifting? And if so, what kind of trends are you observing in the survey data that you collect?
Well, first of all, thank you for hosting me. I really appreciate it. I'm really pleased to be with my colleagues on this panel. Let me put it this way. There has been a continuing, in some cases, really dramatic shift in American public opinion, mostly among Democrats, but now also among young evangelicals, surprisingly, that's far more critical of Israel and more sympathetic with the Palestinians. But before I give you some examples, I want to make 2 points. The first is that the principal reason why this shift in public opinion remains less visible on official Washington, and why the gap between public opinion and elected officials remains wide, is that Israel-Palestine is not now anywhere near a priority for anyone but lobbyists focused on this issue. And even normally, public opinion, of course, is only one factor in the American political process, often trumped by other factors, especially large campaign contributions. But the second point I want to make is that the proposition that it's only progressives who have grown more critical of Israel and US policies that are uncritically supportive of Israel is inaccurate, at least at the level of public opinion. The shift is far broader, especially among Democrats, in some cases overcompassing large majorities. And let me just give you some examples before I end. The first is that in the public opinion polling that we've been doing, now more Democrats want the US to take the Palestinian side than the Israeli side, by the way, by a ratio of 2-to-1 right now, and even higher among Democrats under 35, though most still want the US to take neither side. A second finding is that more Democrats blame Israel for the May Gaza fighting than blame the Palestinians. This is something that followed the Gaza war. And in fact, we also found that more people, especially young Democrats, who are unsatisfied with the way Biden reacted to that war, with about half Democrats really being unapproving of the way Biden handled the Gaza crisis. Overwhelmingly, Democrats and even most Republicans favor a democratic Israel, even if it no longer is a Jewish state, according to our polls, over a Jewish Israel that's not democratic. And for years, by the way, our polls have found that most Democrats support U.S. sanctions or tougher measures against Israeli settlement. Robert mentioned the consensus opposition to settlements, but it's not just consensus opposition. It's really even supporting the U.S. taking drastic measures to stop settlements, which certainly has not been reflected in our political process and certainly not in Congress. Overwhelmingly, Democrats and most others, including Republicans, oppose laws that punish boycotts of Israel, principally due to concerns about civil rights. By the way, even on BDS, where less than half of Democrats had ever heard of the movement, nearly half of those who had heard of the movement say that they support it, and fewer than 20% oppose it. Overwhelmingly, Democrats who have heard of BDS think it's a illegitimate movement, even more than 3/4. And finally, more than 2/3 of Democrats and most Republicans think it's acceptable, or even it is a duty of their elected representatives in Congress to question the U.S.-Israeli relationship. These are just a few of the findings that we have had in recent years, and this has been continuing. We've seen the erosion of support and more criticism of Israel, and more support of harsher measures against Israeli policies over the years. With the one that we've done after the Gaza war was especially strongly critical of Israel. So the bottom line is, as you could see from those examples, this goes well beyond progressives, certainly at the level of public opinion. And when the Israeli-Palestinian issue rises in the public priorities, it isn't now, as you know, I mean, not, and understandably, either it's for the Biden administration, for the public, or for Congress, but when it does rise in the attention of the public, as it did during the Gaza fighting in May, then even US officials in Congress, including those who are typically pro-Israel, become more critical. And so critical, in fact, last May, that it may have surprised the Democratic President Biden, who was really must have been struck by the fact that the criticism of his posture of not being critical enough of what was happening or taking initiative to stop it was coming from mainstream Democrats in Congress. So yes, I think that there's been a big shift. And one reason we don't see it is that this is not a priority issue right now.
Thank you. So I'd like to turn to Dr. Efron. Professor Tal-Hami was describing this broad shift that's taken place in Israeli public opinion. There's been a shift in American public opinion. There's been a shift in American Jewish opinion for some time toward more critical attitudes, still strongly supportive of Israel, but differentiating between that and supporting Israeli government policies. Do you think that American Jews are still Israel's most important ally in the United States, or have evangelical Christians, Professor Tal-Hami mentioned, have they been supplanted by evangelical Christians? And if so, what does this mean for the US-Israel relationship going forward? Does it mean that Israeli governments will just pay more attention to the views of evangelical Christians than Jewish Americans, as some argue Netanyahu's governments did?
Thank you, Dov, for this question. Great to be here with such terrific experts. And Dov, you're yourself an expert on these issues. I'll speak maybe a little bit, continue where Shibli stopped and pick on US Jews. But if you allow me, I'll also want to just dive a little bit into the numbers on how Israeli Jews, and I'm just going to speak about Israeli Jews, even though 21% of the population are of Palestinian descent, because it's interesting to see how both sides look at each other. And I think it's interesting because there are the policy issues that Martin and Rob spoke about, and there are the more public opinion issues. So when we look at American Jews, it's and Shibli is the expert on American public opinion, but my understanding it's a different group to survey for a variety of reasons, which we don't have to get into now. It's getting into the weeds. But if we're looking at polls, what we're seeing is the majority of Jews, obviously we're seeing it in voting patterns. The majority of Jews obviously vote for the Democratic Party, and also still, for the most part, they remain pro-Zionism. Not unconditional with criticism, but still support the idea of Zionism. And we can unpack what this actually means today, but that's what we're finding in the polls. But let's break it down for a second. If we're looking at the growing subpopulations within the Jewish community in the US, there are the ultra-Orthodox, which I'm sorry, in surveys, I don't see the differentiation between modern and ultra-Orthodox. That's 10% of the population, but it's the fastest growing part. And those are actually, I think, not always has been the case, but now they're predominantly Republican, conservatives, obviously more religious. So they resemble Israeli conservatives on one hand. The other group that is growing and consists of 30% of the Jewish population is what they call the unidentified. It's, you don't relate to a certain stream of Judaism, neither Reform, Orthodox, or conservative. We're seeing more young people in this group. And this connects to the trend that the younger you are, you're also more liberal and progressive. And as part of intersectionality and whatever the reason is, you have less affinity to Israel, either just like negative views on Israel or just indifference. And there's a growing, I think, tension between this idea of being liberal and also being pro-Zionism. And this was, if these two trends continue, at least with the big group, this will remain in the future. Now, we have to speak about it because there was a change in government now in Israel, and Martin started with it. The last 12 years, I think the damage Netanyahu did to ties, and we can go into the specific examples, left a serious mark. And we know that by design, his government wanted to turn Israel into a partisan issue and prioritized conservative evangelicals over what they call liberal Jews. And for those of you listening and who haven't seen the remarkable interview that Netanyahu's ambassador to Washington, Ron Dermer, gave, where he actually admitted it, this is important watching. So what it did, probably to right-wing and more pro-Israel Jews, it probably took it to reinforce the belief that they're the ones who really care about Israel, right? And haven't abandoned Zionism. And liberal Jews took it as an affirmation of what they felt all these years, the last decade, that Israel's right-wing government has really delegitimized them, betrayed them, forsaken them because they won't support Israeli policies. And the Israelis are ungrateful to the diaspora, and that Israel is losing its ways. And probably most American Jews in the middle probably ask, who is Ron Dermer? But, this is really the case. So this is where I think the U.S. Jews are. If you have more and more minutes, I'll just tell you, I think Israelis are interesting because across the board, and you see surveys, INSS is an interesting survey that comes out every year, and you see that Israelis feel that they're absolutely dependent on the United States. You ask, there's an interesting survey question listing challenges of what can Israel withstand? And one of the questions is about lower U.S. support. And I think 82% say that this is it's a concerning trend if Israel would lose the U.S. support. But this doesn't push Israelis to think, oh, we have to be better to America. It actually says, like, we're so dependent on them. That scares us, so we have to be self-sufficient. So it's kind of a paradox in the Israeli responses. And you have overwhelming support for Israel having to be independent. Now, when we're talking about the youth, and I think that's the most interesting part, whereas we look in the US and in Europe and other parts of the world, and you see young people, let's talk about the age of 18 and over, they're less religious, they're more liberal. In Israel, it's the opposite. Israelis, and we're seeing this across all polls, it's really interesting phenomenon. They're very conservative. They define themselves as right-wing. Most of this generation was born after the Second Intifada. They don't even understand the idea of peace and peace process. And they're very, they're really just conservative. And I'll just give you an example. There was an idea of would you join the national Hasbara efforts? And 62% of the Israeli public said that they would join the Hasbara efforts, meaning like doing PR for the state of Israel, which means that they agree with their policies. And with the Israeli youth, this number was closer to 80%. So I guess I'd sum up, and we're probably going to dive into these issues. I think with the new Israeli government that really wants to repair ties and move away from the Bibi years, and I think also US Jews probably on the other side have been eager and willing to view this new government as a chance to reset ties beyond the Netanyahu era. So I think there's a grace period now. But at the end of the day, it's not just Bibi, anti-Bibi. There are fundamental policy issues and differences in values and questions about state and religion. And the two sides don't see eye to eye on these. And I don't see any change in those trends.
Thank you. So I want to thank you all for your really substantial, thoughtful answers. I want to zoom out a little bit now and ask about a premise that's often unstated when it comes to discussing US-Israel relations. And the premise is that both sides need each other, that Israel's national interests and America's national interests are served by this strong alliance. And I wonder whether that premise is still as true today as it was in the past, whether, particularly on the American side, as the United States is reevaluating its engagement in the Middle East, its interest in the Middle East, whether, quite simply, there's less at stake for the United States, and there's less for it to gain from this kind of very substantial and intense investment in, for example, trying to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Ambassador Enrich, do you see a shift in America's interests in this relationship? Is it less important than it was? You've written about Henry Kissinger, and he obviously used the US-Israel relationship as a way to advance the United States' wider interests in the region. Would that be relevant any longer?
Yes, actually, ironically, it's kind of as relevant today as it was back in Kissinger's day, and for a similar reason. Back then, the United States was also in a retrenchment mood, coming off the withdrawal from Vietnam, and was facing domestic turmoil with the Watergate impeachment process. And so Kissinger operated in an environment not that different to the one that President Biden is operating in today. But the real relevance of Kissinger is that he looked to create order in the Middle East that would be based on a balance of power. If you apply that principle today, with the United States shifting its focus to Asia and being more concerned about correcting the balance of power in that part of the world, countering a rising China, and therefore having to move resources and attention away from the Middle East and away from the kind of forever wars in the Middle East, then as a result, the United States still has to be concerned about maintaining order in the Middle East. And that therefore requires the United States to depend upon its allies more than it needed to when it was dominating the region over the last 40 years. And therefore, countries like Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the other Sunni Arab states become, in a way, more important as the United States shift to a more kind of offshore balancing approach, where it's supporting its local partners and allies as they maintain a balance of power in favor of stability and order. So in that context, Israel is the most capable militarily and one of the most powerful economies in the region, becomes more important. But that doesn't mean that the United States writes Israel a blank check. Far from it. What we need, and what the Biden administration is telling all of its partners in the region, is we need them to act responsibly. We need them to calm things down, quote unquote. That's the new policy, calm things down. And amazingly, they're more or less responding to that. The kinds of things that Bob Wexler talked about in terms of actions taken by the Israeli government are designed to calm things down. The Egyptians are working with Israel in Gaza to calm things down. We're trying hard to get the Saudis to calm things down in Yemen. They don't cooperate so much, but to some extent they are. And we see the Arab Sunni states engaging Iran and in the process of setting up dialogues with Iran and understandings with Iran, which are also in the service of calming things down. And then the United States is sending envoys to Ethiopia and the Sudan and Yemen and Libya with exactly the same purpose in mind. So you already see the architecture developing of a new regional power-led order in which the United States shift being the supportive power, superpower.
Thank you. I want to extend this question to Congressman Wexler, in particular with regards to the US interest in promoting or mediating a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And you talked in your previous answer about some of the steps that the United States could take in that regard if it sets its mind to it. But is it still the case that, the holy grail of Israeli-Palestinian peace is something that is so important for the US? I mean, if the United States is able to keep a lid on the situation there, avoid being dragged into renewed escalation of violence, is it still true that America would be willing to really place its political capital on the line to try to negotiate an agreement?
Well, we should place our political capital on the line, but it's not to reach a final status outcome comprehensive agreement. That's where this time is different from the previous times where people like Ambassador Enrich and others led very important efforts. No one in Israel, not anyone in the Palestinian side, and very few people in Washington are focused on a comprehensive resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What we can do, and what would serve the interests of both Israelis and Palestinians, and I think America's, is to design progress that improves conditions, the lives of Israelis and Palestinians, builds some modicum of hope, particularly on the Palestinian side, that progress is possible, and in certain ways builds a two-state reality to be contrasted from seeking a two-state outcome when politically it's not possible. And I think if we were, meaning the United States, to pursue that type of diplomatic approach, number one, we could be successful, which would be something different. But it would also give a great deal of boost to the Palestinian side. The Palestinian private sector has been disproportionately decimated by COVID. The Palestinian Authority obviously is less credible today with its own people than it ever has. The Palestinians need something to hope for. They need real progress. They need to see jobs in their neighborhoods. They need to be able to get in their cars with greater confidence and drive somewhere where it's a coherent transportation network. Yes, more job permits to travel into Israel is a positive thing, but that can't be the only answer. The good news is that there are ideas like connecting the northern West Bank to the port of Haifa through railroad connections that would give a certain element of Palestinian autonomy to businesses and to the Palestinian Authority that would change the dynamic. We've had over a decade of failure. It doesn't even matter who's to blame, but we have an opportunity, and the Abraham Accords are the backdrop that provide a somewhat encouraging framework. But in fairness, the Palestinians, of course, have not been included and have been largely against the normalization effort. But that's where Democrats, particularly the Biden administration, can provide a different approach that will bring the Palestinians in. If we do that, we will build a different set of realities. And in 3 years, 4 years, 6 years, we might be able to talk about something more ambitious. But the most important thing is for the Biden administration not to set out for a comprehensive agreement. That would be a death knell. No, we create expectations that are realistic, in my humble opinion, meaning improve conditions, and where possible, narrow the political differences between the sides.
Thank you. Professor Telhami, I want to ask you specifically about the impact that you see Palestinians having on on the US debate over Israel-Palestine, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One of the shifts I think we've observed in recent years is the growing number of Palestinian voices being heard in these discussions, both Palestinian Americans, Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza. in a way that it's not just the Palestinian Authority or the PLO spokespeople who we hear from now. Do you think the Palestinian voice is shifting this debate and maybe challenging some of the conventional wisdom that's governed for so long?
Good question. Let me relate it actually to the conversation that was started by Martin and Robert about the strategic picture. Honestly, yes, of course, there's all these elements, the strategic elements that are important, particularly now as the U.S. disengaging from the Middle East. But the reality of it is that the American relationship with Israel has survived every period, including when the U.S. was present and dominant, including when the U.S. had withdrawn, because Israel in the U.S. is as much a domestic issue, even more of a domestic issue than it is a foreign policy issue. And let's be clear about that. That is, the relationship is not in the first place going to be determined by strategic calculus. It is going to be determined by the nature of American politics. It is part and parcel. We could, that's another conversation to get into. But that conversation in America is shifting. And it's shifting not because of individual Palestinian voices, no. It is because at the core, while the Palestinian question has strategic consequences for sure, and even after the normalization with Arab states still resonates in Arab public opinion in a way that's consequential, it is at the core right now a moral issue. And that moral issue is a big one because it has become a prototype for a lot of people who subscribe to a different system of values. In America right now, we're certainly divided, but we're not just divided Republican and Democrats, Trumpists and non-Trumpists. It's a value divide. And there is a group of people that focus on international law, on social justice, on equality, on anti-racism, on egalitarianism. And the question of Palestine, to the extent that it has succeeded in becoming part of this conversation, it has become a prototype of this struggle for a lot of people. So a lot of those Democrats who want to empathize with the Palestinians are not doing it for strategic arguments. They're doing it because they see the issue of Israel-Palestine right now through the prism of social justice. That's why, like Black Lives Matter had such an impact. And even on young evangelicals, as I wrote recently about the transformation among young evangelicals who increasingly see the issue through the prism of social justice, not through the prism of strategic thinking or even biblical thinking. So yes, I think that's part of the conversation. And it's an important part of the conversation. Is it transformative in politics? We all know how politics is done. And as I said, public opinion is only one part of a bigger mix of issues that influence politics. It needs to rise in the priorities, but when it does, we see that it has an impact.
Thank you. Well, we just have time, I think, for another question I want to pose to Dr. Efron, talking about this issue of strategic interests and how much both sides need each other. Do you think on the Israeli side, there is still a consensus that the United States is Israel's indispensable ally, or is American support for Israel now seen as somewhat less important as Israel has strengthened its relations with other great powers and rising powers like China?
Just before that, there was just a lot of talk here about the views on the Palestinian issue in the US. And you have to understand that in Israel, no one thinks, or at least the Jewish population, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not an issue that the vast majority of Israelis think about. There was a question recently, and it was very, very subtly nuanced. It's INSS, and they used the legal definition of the control of people in Judea and Samaria. When they asked the question, and 70% of Israelis do not consider Israel's control of people and territories as occupation, even though this is the legal terminology that is used in Israel and by the IDF. So there's a big disconnect, and this disconnect is going to continue, as I said before. And I just don't see, short of, I said this with great sadness, short of sporadic violence that remind Israeli Jews that there is a conflict. This is not something that's on the Israeli radar. When you look at, and I mentioned before, on the strategic picture, there's no substitute in Israeli eyes for the United States. They know this is, and I mentioned, right, they see that this is one of the concerns would be a lower US support for Israel. When the Iranian strikes on Saudi Aramco facilities, and the US did not intervene on behalf of Saudi Arabia, to which it sells the most sophisticated weapons in the world, so you would think that it might be able to defend themselves. There was a question in Israel, and Israeli said, oh, the United States is not going to come to our rescue either, so we have to learn how to defend ourselves. But when you look at after the United States, which other countries are most important for you, Israelis would say, I think it's 24% Russia, 22% China, there's Europe. So there's definitely a growing perception of it's the US is the most, but there are other countries. And that is important. And, you know, Israel, like many other countries, is hedging. This comes mostly to the great power competition with China. Of course, Israel is mostly to the side of the US, but you can't ignore the fact that it's no longer a unipolar world.
Thank you. I saw Ambassador Indik, you nodded your head with regards to Dr. Efron talking about Israel hedging its policy vis-a-vis China. Do you see it hedging, or do you think Israel is firmly aligned behind the United States?
Shira is right in the way that she put it, but I think hedging is overrated, not just for Israel, but for the Arab states as well. As much as they recognize that the United States is shifting its focus elsewhere, and that they are no longer the subject of our attention and affections, and in the way that they used to be. The alternatives to depending on the United States for their ultimate security are all suboptimal, let's put it that way. And that's particularly true of China. And so, yeah, they're looking to see what advantage they can get from engaging with China, selling to China, of course, selling oil to China, in Israel's case, selling technology, arms, and so on to China. But in the end, they all prefer the United States. And so I think that you know, the United States will be responsive to that. It's not turning its back on the region. But I do think that the adjustment to the pivot that the United States is engaged in will be less problematic and less of a major change for the United States or the parties in the region. It's just going to be a kind of readjustment of the balance between the United States and our allies and partners there, where, as I said, they step up and we step back.
Thank you. So we have very little time, and I want to put you all on the spot for one last quick response. And that's the future of US military aid for Israel. There's going to be, in the next few years, the need to renew or revise the Memorandum of Understanding, the $38 billion 10-year agreement that the Obama administration signed with Israel. Given what we've been talking about, shifts in public opinion, America's changing strategic interests in the region, do you see this military aid continuing in the same form, or do you think the next time it comes up, whether $38 billion more or more than that, will be a lot harder sell, a more contentious process than it was last time around? And this is just a very quick, just if everybody gives me their prediction for how this military aid is going to be handled the next time it comes up. So maybe I'll start with you, Congressman Wexler.
The assistance package to Israel will continue. It'll enjoy bipartisan support in the United States Congress. The margins of support will be significant. However, the Israeli government would be wise to take notice as to the changing public opinion and debate, as Shibli rightly points out, and others. And they should take action to create a dynamic of progress. It requires a Palestinian partner. Palestinians have a self-interest to advance that progress now as well. So if there is any element of progress, that assistance and the whole dynamic will actually get even easier. The Israeli government should also take notice regarding settlements. And this isn't just the Republican or Democratic Party, it's both parties have a great concern about advancing settlements, particularly settlement building that is not within the closer regions around Jerusalem, not in the settlement blocks, but even east of the security barrier that Israel built. That creates more political tension that endangers this kind of smooth sailing for the assistance packages, which are well-deserved and in the American interest.
Professor Telhami, do you predict that the package will sail through, or do you think the next time around it's going to be a lot more?
Probably it will, but let me just say something, because I think we focused on the money. The money is important, of course, a lot of money, but that Israel is a wealthy country, it can deal without the money. It's really the technology. It is the cutting edge technology, the edge that Israel has with the Arab, and protection at the UN against international actions that the US is really kind of the buffer zone there. Those are the two that are most critical for Israel. And those two, will be in play. Imagine Bernie Sanders could have been the president of the United States right now. I mean, that was pretty close call. And could you have imagined if President Sanders saying, well, I'm going to withhold certain weapons for now, even despite what Congress might think, until XYZ? Yes. Can you expect, can we anticipate another person like Sanders in this democratic environment? Yes. So I think in the short term, probably no threat, as Robert Wexler has noted. But I think that it's an evolving dynamic.
Dr. Efron, do you share this reasonable confidence?
Before I go into predictions, which I don't do, I just want to say, because I can get into trouble in Israel if I say something about China. I don't think Israel is hedging with China on security. It's on economics. So Israel is 100% as aligned with the US on security issues and does nothing with China on defense issues, since there were a few crises we can't get into. Probably people here remember, but it's the hedging more in lines with what countries in Europe do, and not so much countries in the region. So again, I don't do predictions. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I think Shibli spoke about the most important point. And if I were the Israeli government, I would say, listen, it's not Israel that it used to be. More billionaires per capita than any other country. We hear about one unicorn after the other. We don't need United States of America to pay for military boots. We need access to this technology. And this access is something that I don't see Israelis bringing up themselves, but if I were advising the Israeli government, I think this is where the conversation needs to go.
Thank you. I just add, Dov, I think that Israelis would be wise, and I'll shock everybody by saying this, by actually copying a play that Netanyahu made when he first became prime minister. He came to Washington and he said that Israel's economy was such that it could afford to reduce its dependence on American economic assistance, and then engaged in a detailed negotiation. I was involved in it too, in which Israel's economic assistance was taken down to zero. He very cleverly switched it so that Israel's military assistance was taken up, so it was completely compensated. But as Shibli says, Israel is a strong country economically and militarily, and it needs to stand on its own 2 feet when it comes to its dependence on the United States for this level of assistance, largest amount of assistance in the world. Yeah, we can make all the arguments about why it serves the US interest, and I agree with all of that. But from Israel's point of view, it's time for the relationship to mature into one that Israel is less dependent on the United States. I was shocked, actually, that Benny Gantz, the defense minister, rushed to Washington to ask for $1 billion in additional assistance to pay for the Iron Dome replacements after a 10-day war. Israel, I think, should have thought twice about doing that. And you can see the way in which it's become a political football in the United States to Israel's detriment. I just think that Israel should think about approaching the United States with a step-by-step reduction in the amount of assistance it gets in return for the kinds of things that Shibli and Shira were talking about, which is continued technological transfer that's critical to not just to Israel's military edge, but also to a technological edge.
Well, I wish we could continue this conversation because it's been fascinating. We've touched on a lot of issues. I want to thank you all for your insights, your wisdom. I've learned a lot, and I hope everybody in the audience has as well. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for being on this panel and for appearing. Thanks so much.
And we're with former Defense Minister Moshe Bogi Ya'alon, also former Chief of General Staff of the IDF. Mr. Ya'alon, we're all hearing now about the attempts to resume the nuclear talks between Iran and the world powers. And there's a general feeling that 7 or 8 or even 10 years of Israeli policy vis-a-vis Iran have failed. Iran, as we're being told, is the closest it's ever been to a nuclear weapons capability. Accusations are flying between the current government and leaders of the previous government. What's your take on this?
No doubt that Iran has become to be the main generator or instigator for instability in the Middle East, with its fingerprints in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq, undermining the Sunni regimes in the region, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, and more. The whole idea is to export the revolution, and they need the nuclear umbrella, first of all, to be able to intensify their activities to export the revolution. I would claim that, I follow the project since the 90s, serving as head of the intelligence, military intelligence in Israel. If nothing has been done, I believe there will be even in further progress in the project.
They would have had nuclear weapons by now?
I'm not sure that they made the decision to have the nuclear weapon, but to become a threshold nuclear state, they are there. Looking back to the policy in the last decade or so, the main mistake was the withdrawal of the US administration from the JCPOA, which was an historic mistake, the JCPOA. It would have been a very different agreement, but it probably was better than not having the agreement and to allow the Iranians to use the withdrawal as an excuse to go ahead with the project. And now, yes, they are in the closest stage that they have been ever to become a threshold state.
Let's just rewind to May 2018, when the Trump administration decided to withdraw from the JCPOA. I think it's fair to say, with, if not pressure, then a lot of encouragement from the Israeli government, from then Prime Minister Netanyahu, that you think was a mistake. Once they'd signed the JCPOA, it would have been better to stick with it.
It was a mistake, for sure. I claim it even before the decision. I published an article about it, warning that the United States shouldn't have withdrawn from the JCPOA, even trying to have the coalition, which was in the Obama administration, to have the P5+1, to have Europe with you, China and Russia on board, which was the case in 2010. They voted for sanctions in the UN Security Council. It is given now. What should have been done now? It's not a lost case. I don't claim this. We are now they crossed the point of no return. I claim that this regime, Khamenei, in 2 cases in history, when he met the dilemma whether to go on with his rogue activities on the nuclear, as well as the missiles, as well as the proliferation of terror and arms in the region, when he met such a dilemma, his choice was survivability. What should have been done now? This is my recommendation. Political isolation of the regime, creating a new coalition in order to reach this objective, crippling economic sanctions, to include China and Russia.
But
it is
China
possible.
Don't seem to be very interested in playing in this.
And to have a credible military option. US one, Israeli one. That was the case in 2012, when Khamenei has to apologize when he decided to be engaged with the great Satan America. I claim it is still possible to reach it, but it is up to the US administration policy, namely US determination, not to allow a military nuclear Iran, which is, of course, the Israeli objective, should have been the European objective, no doubt, of the Arab regimes in the region objective, and the United States.
It doesn't sound that the Biden administration has a credible military, specifically not after the debacle in Afghanistan in August.
So far, I'm afraid that you are right, Angel. I'm afraid. You know, not to respond to the Iranian provocations in Iraq, the Iranian provocations against Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, in Lebanon, you know, but it is not a lost case. You know, the Middle East has been changed dramatically. There is no Israeli-Arab conflict whatsoever. There is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a marginal one. The main problem in the Middle East is a struggle between three radical movements for hegemony in the region. It's not about Western hegemony or external hegemony. It's between the Iranian Shia regime to export the revolution, to have a Shia Middle East and beyond, the jihadists claiming for Islamic Caliphate, and of course Turkey, which claims to have a neo-Ottoman empire led by the Sultan. In this case, all of us, we and the Arabs, are on the same side, on the same boat. This should have been the case with the United States, Europe, and other adversaries in the region, I believe.
So basically, David Ben-Gurion's alliance with the peripheries has been inverted, and now the peripheries, except Israel, are facing Israel and the Arabs together.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right.
And when you see Israel's role in this, so you mentioned the Biden administration has to be more forceful in presenting or projecting the possibility of a military option. What does Israel do this time? Does Israel remain quiet? Does it shout? Does it resort to quiet diplomacy, clandestine activities? What would be your recommendation for the new government?
Holding very big stick and soft talk.
Speaking very softly.
That's it. And I believe, you know,
because when you were defense minister, Netanyahu went to Congress to challenge publicly Obama on the JCPOA. That wasn't something that you thought was a good idea at the time.
I wasn't happy with it because at the end, the relationship between Israel and the United States is a cornerstone in our national security. And we shouldn't fight the Americans. We should cooperate with the Americans. We should convince the Americans. This is the case now. I believe that the new government in Israel understands it. And that's why we have now all kinds of talks on very high level, on the military level, intelligence level. It's very, very important.
But we don't have the same kind of confrontation between the prime ministers that we had between Obama and Netanyahu. You think that's a better case?
That's good news. We should be on the same side with the Americans. We might argue. I'm not happy with the Biden administration so far regarding the policy in the Middle East, the disengagement, the withdrawal, the way that we withdrew from Afghanistan. But we have the way, the channels to discuss it and to convince, from my point of view, the Americans not to disengage with the Middle East. If you run away from terror, the terror will reach you.
Let's shift our focus a bit closer to Israel's borders, to Syria. You, as defense minister, were one of the leaders of what was then a quiet war in Syria against Iranian entrenchment there. We've been seeing in the last few weeks almost a love fest between some of what we call the moderate Arab regimes, the ones even close to Israel, have started to re-welcome Bashar Assad into their midst, into the Arab family. How do you see that panning out?
I worry about the new contacts between the Sunni Arab regimes and Iran. It reflects the fact that they understand the United States is not going to play a significant role in the region. It is worrisome. Regarding Assad, it is given. You know, Syria is not going to be reunified anymore. Now we have on the Syrian soil the Alawites led by Bashar al-Assad. We have the ISIS elements all over. We have Turkey on the northern part. We have the Russians deploying over there. And unfortunately, we have the Iranians. So it's an ongoing struggle in which Israel, in a very smart way, we don't allow it. I'm happy that we don't claim responsibility for any activity.
After you left the defense ministry, they started to take
I was very critical to it. You know, you can.
But it's now a fact.
If you want to shoot, don't talk.
But we're now 10 years, by now more than 10 years after the civil war began in Syria, and we both remember the intelligence assessment saying Assad will be gone within weeks or months.
That wasn't my assessment.
Okay, but a lot of the intelligence of people who you had appointed were saying that. And now we know Assad is there for the foreseeable future. Can you see a future in which even Israel is dealing with him, like the Emiratis and the Jordanians now are?
The main objective and the interest of Israel as well as the Arab regimes, not to allow Iranian presence in Syria. And if Assad is there...
Despite everything that's happened in the last 10 years and the hundreds of thousands of deaths under his regime,
in the end, you know, there was an opportunity to Obama at the time to attack Bashar al-Assad, and it was
the red
zigzagging as the red line. It was and another mistake, you know. The U.S. strategic posture in the Middle East has been harmed in many cases. Not responding to Houthis' attack against USS Mason, a U.S. Navy frigate. Recently, not responding to
Mercer Street.
Iranian militias, UAVs attacking the U.S. deployment in Tanaf, as an example, or the green zone in Iraq, to include try to assassinate Prime Minister Khatami. If you don't respond in a way, in aggressive way, you might be seen as very weak, and in the end, the Iranians will have more provocations as a result of it.
And into that vacuum, which is being left by, you say, the American posture no longer being as forward projecting as it used to be, has come Russia. And that happened on your watch, Russia deployed to Syria. Do you think this has changed the balance here, or it's not a major deployment by the Russians? It still is something small just to keep Assad on their side.
It changed the balance in Syria to keep
but do you see Assad in a more...
But regarding our interests, you know, we have found a way to coordinate the activities with Russia. It happened in my watch as a defense minister when I realized on September 2015 that they are going to be deployed. I called the Russian defense attaché to my bureau in Tel Aviv, and I said, you have your own interest, we have our interest. We are not going to harm yours, don't harm our interest, and it works. As you know, till now there is a channel for coordination between our headquarters and the Russian headquarters in Syria. You know, it is so complicated. I'm not sure that the Russians want Iranian presence in Syria. So we share a couple of common interests with the Russians as well.
So very quickly, because we're almost out of time, you mentioned the fact that there's no Israel-Arab conflict, there's an Israel-Palestinian conflict, and that's, you said, almost a side issue. But we saw in May how, with Gaza in flames, East Jerusalem, and many of the mixed cities within Israel being gripped by violence, that this side issue can suddenly grasp the agenda back again. You're not concerned by that? You think that that's going to remain a side issue?
I'm concerned, but this is not existential threat for the state of Israel. And I don't want to go to what had happened in May. In many cases, I claimed that our behavior, allowing to the Israeli extremists to act in Sheikh Jarrah, in Temple Mount, in the cities like Lod and Acre and Tiberias, So I believe that Israel is strong enough to deter Hamas, to deter Hezbollah, but you know, the epicenter, the core for instability is still in Iran.
But you said that you used the word existential. Is there an existential threat to Israel? Or is even Iran, because that was part of the argument, perhaps the core of your argument with Prime Minister Netanyahu, how existential a threat is Israel facing? Are there any existential threats left?
Today, there is no external existential threat to the state of Israel. But if Iran will have a military nuclear capability, it will be a new Middle East, not in the right way and not for our interest. That's why the Israeli objective should be not to allow a military nuclear Iran by all means.
Moshe Alon, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for watching.
Thank you to the UCLA Y&S Nazarian Center for Israel Studies and Haaretz for hosting me. It's an honor to take part in this conversation with so many distinguished colleagues. This forum should remind all of us that the United States and Israel are bound together by so much more than official diplomatic relations and national security interests. It is our shared values and our vibrant democratic institutions, like our excellent public universities and an empowered free press, that ultimately unite our two countries. Our bond is built atop a collective desire to continually strengthen our societies, to build brighter futures for our children and our children's children, and to create a more just and humane world. Look, we all know that democracy can be messy at times. Whether it's administering free and fair elections or passing new budgets or advancing a lasting legislative agenda that ensures government delivers for all of its constituencies, the enterprise of democratic self-government is rife with challenges. But we also know democracy is humanity's best hope for achieving a brighter future. Just as the Biden administration has put together the most diverse cabinet in U.S. history, one that represents voices of those who have never had a seat at the table at the highest levels of our government, so too has this Israeli government put together what I believe is the most diverse coalition government in its history. I am not so naive as to suggest these alliances make the work of governing any easier, but I do believe the work that does get done is more lasting and meaningful when it serves the aspirations of as many of its people as possible. So allow me to congratulate the Israeli government on passing your first budget in 3 years. As most of you know, our Democratic majority is knee-deep in negotiations over a historic budget reconciliation bill. And while there's light at the end of the tunnel, the road is full of twists and turns. What matters is that we never forget that progress is always possible. At the same time, we are all too aware that in free and democratic societies, there are those who seem fixated on stalling progress, who insist on being the loudest voice, even if they represent the smallest of opinions. Indeed, here in the United States, there are a tiny handful of voices on both sides of the political spectrum who seek to question the relationship, the U.S.-Israel relationship, who do not appreciate the complex history of the region, nor respect the depth of our bond. Well, I am here to tell you to simply look at the facts. This summer, as a terrorist organization devoted to Israel's destruction indiscriminately fired rockets into civilian centers over the summer, the United States Congress overwhelmingly backed Israel's right to self-defense and the U.S.-Israel security relationship that supports it. And we will continue to do so. So while some try to claim otherwise, the U.S.-Israel relationship remains strong and will continue to be strong, especially if we focus on a few overarching elements. First, we will continue doing exactly what you're doing today, building bridges between our two countries, embracing the values and institutions that make both our nations so rich. Second, the United States will continue to support the U.S.-Israel relationship and our security relationship. No nation on earth can be accepted to simply accept terrorist organizations on its border calling for its destruction while amassing rocket arsenals. And no matter the conflict, I think we can all agree that the protection of civilian lives must be paramount, and that we mourn the loss of innocent life, regardless of nationality, ethnicity, or religions. We will continue supporting the life-saving Iron Dome missile system, which protects civilians regardless of creed or ethnicity. And I am beyond confident that unlike Hamas's barbaric practice of hiding rockets in schools, basements, and in using civilians as human shields, the Israeli military will continue its practices of warning civilian areas of pending operations and going above and beyond to protect civilian lives. We must also build on the regional component of these threats to Israel. As you may know, the House and Senate Foreign Relations Committee have passed versions of a bill to celebrate the historic Abraham Accords and look for ways to continue increasing U.S. support for facilitating more Israeli diplomatic relations with other Muslim-majority countries. In the Senate, in fact, this is happening in real time and potentially working its way to the National Defense Authorization Act as a vehicle, so stay tuned. In May, it was deeply distressing to see the sheer volume of rocket fire from Gaza despite the cordon of its land and sea borders. While I have been heartened to see increased security operation between Israel and its neighbors in the Eastern Mediterranean and Red Sea, including Egypt, I believe that the United States can and should do more to improve security cooperation and tackle the maritime and land smuggling routes used by Hamas to illicitly stockpile rockets or component parts. There is also legislation moving that would increase sanctions on those who facilitate support for Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Third, and building on this theme of increasing regional relationships, the United States must continue to coordinate with Israel and other Middle Eastern countries to seriously constrain the threat from Iran. While the United States is set to restart indirect talks with the Iranians later this month in Vienna, I remain skeptical about both the practice and political viability of a return to the JCPOA. I was not, as many of you know, a supporter of the JCPOA in 2015. However, I was also not supportive of the way the Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from the deal without a serious diplomatic path forward in concert with our allies to constrain Iran's nuclear program, to say nothing of its support for terrorism. Unfortunately, Iran's current unacceptable escalation of its nuclear program is exactly what I expressed concern about at that time. History has shown us that multilateral support for sanctions and other pressure is critical. At this point, Iran is so far out of compliance with the terms of the JCPOA, and some of the measures under UNSCR 2231 have expired. So I believe we need to look beyond the JCPOA. Senator Lindsey Graham and I have recently been reviving the idea of a regional nuclear fuel bank. While similar efforts may have been tried before, we believe we should be open to any and all kinds of regional diplomatic engagement that could slow Iran's nuclear weaponization efforts and avert a nuclear arms race in an already volatile region. Senator Graham and I continue to work together on this front because we believe that bipartisan support from the United States Congress is critical to the political longevity of any successful multilateral diplomatic effort. Beyond Iran's nuclear program, of course, we must also continue working with Israel and our allies to address Iran's ongoing and growing regional terrorist threats. While we must do so carefully and within the confines of U.S. law, we must find ways to support the people of Lebanon and the Lebanese armed forces. Another collapsed state on Israel's border would not only threaten Israel, but the region as a whole. We must continue fighting terrorist elements in Syria and all the ways in which Iran has exploited and fomented the conflict there. Finally, here in the United States, those of us committed to the U.S.-Israel relationship will continue to push back against all those who try to taint it with partisan politics. When rockets are raining down on civilians inside Israel, it is not the time to call for conditioning assistance. Similarly, when young Palestinians express a desire for a brighter future and new leadership, it is not the time to cut critical assistance efforts in full compliance with U.S. laws. We will continue to use our voice and vote at the global stage and at home to push back on misguided and lopsided efforts to delegitimize Israel, from stopping the misguided BDS movement from seeping into completely unrelated conversations, to speaking out against offensive and ludicrous targeting of Israel by a Human Rights Council whose members remain silent on crimes against humanity in countries just over the border. And we will continue to speak out against the recent resurgence of anti-Semitism and violent white nationalism that undermines the enterprise of democracy whenever and wherever it rears its ugly head. We will continue to facilitate efforts in support of a two-state solution which allows Israelis and Palestinians to live in peace, security, and dignity. And last but not least, we must remain a reliable and honest friend to Israel. We must stand by them when they are under attack, and we must speak the truth. We must find the nuance. We are capable of doing so, and we owe it to our own values and the values that form the basis of that friendship. Leadership matters. I hope to see you all in person at some point in the future. Thank you.
Well, that concludes our conference. I hope you've all found it to be interesting, informative, and thought-provoking. We've heard from a wide range of voices, and it's really been a wonderful experience to be part of this special conference. I'd like to, again, extend my thanks to Haaretz and to encourage you all to view this conference or share it. You can go to Haaretz's website, where it'll be available, as well as the website of the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. Thank you all for joining us and hope to see you again next year.